The scream tore through the war council before anyone could stop it. Ronan Blackwood stood at the head of a long stone table, his palm pressed flat against a map of the northern border, when the doors burst open without warning. A young healer stumbled inside, her robes damp with sweat, her breath ragged from running the entire length of the castle. Every alpha and general in the room turned toward her, but she did not look at them. She looked only at the king. "Your mother," she said. "You must come now." Ronan did not ask what had happened. He did not need to. The healer's eyes told him everything, and something inside his chest went cold and still, like a lake freezing over in a single moment. He straightened, and the map beneath his palm crumpled under the sudden pressure of his grip. "Continue without me," he said to the room, though his voice barely carried. No one moved to stop him. No one dared. He walked first. Then he ran. The corridors of Blackwood Castle stretched long and gray, lit by torches that flickered against ancient stone walls, lined with portraits of kings long dead. Ronan had walked these halls his entire life, had learned to fight in its courtyards, had been crowned in its great hall at the age of 19, when his father's heart gave out during a winter storm. He knew every turn, every uneven stone beneath his boots. But today the distance felt endless, as though the castle itself were trying to keep him from reaching her in time. He was not only a king, he was an alpha, the strongest wolf in a territory that stretched from the frozen northern coasts to the dense pine forests bordering 3 rival kingdoms. Men twice his age flinched when he raised his voice. Packs that had warred against his family for generations had learned to kneel rather than face him in battle. He had built walls, forged alliances, through fear and strength, and ruled with a discipline so total that even his own advisors rarely saw him smile. But none of that mattered now. None of it slowed the pounding of his heart as he reached the West Wing, where his mother's chambers had been moved months ago, closer to the healers, closer to the herbs and remedies that no longer seemed to be working. He pushed open the heavy door without knocking. The room smelled of lavender and burning candle wax, an attempt to mask the sourness of sickness that had settled into the air over recent weeks. Queen Mother Alara lay propped against a mountain of pillows, her silver hair spread across the fabric like frost across a window. She had once been a formidable woman, tall and proud, her voice able to silence an entire hall with a single word. Now her frame looked impossibly small beneath the blankets, her skin pale as parchment, her breathing shallow and uneven. 2 healers stood near the window, speaking in hushed voices. When Ronan entered, they both stopped and bowed their heads, stepping back to give him room. "Leave us," he said. They obeyed instantly, closing the door behind them with a soft click that seemed far too loud in the silence that followed. Ronan crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside the bed, taking his mother's hand in both of his own. Her fingers were cold, thinner than he remembered, the skin loose over bones that had once carried her through decades of ruling beside his father. He had seen death before. He had caused it, on the battlefield, without hesitation, when his kingdom required it. But this was different. This was his mother, and no amount of strength could stop what was happening to her body. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, his voice rough. Alara opened her eyes slowly, and despite everything, despite the exhaustion carved into every line of her face, she managed a faint smile. "You always do," she whispered. "Even as a boy, if I so much as sneezed, you would appear at my door with a blanket and a scowl, demanding I rest. You should be resting now." "I have been resting for 3 months, Ronan. I am tired of resting." Her fingers tightened weakly around his. "I would rather spend what time remains awake, with my son beside me, than asleep and unaware that you are here at all." Ronan swallowed hard. The healers had told him weeks ago that her wolf spirit was fading, that the illness had begun eating away, not just at her body, but at the very core of what made her a shifter. It was rare, they said, cruel, and rare. A sickness that took the wolf first, leaving the human body to follow only days or weeks later. There was no cure, there was no fighting it. For a king who had spent his entire life solving problems through strength and strategy, the helplessness of it was unbearable. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Anything. I will summon healers from every kingdom, from beyond our borders if I must. I will not simply sit here and watch." Alara studied him for a long moment, her pale eyes tracing the hard lines of his face, the tension coiled in his jaw. the way his shoulders carried the weight of a crown even now, kneeling at her bedside. She had watched her son become a king people feared. She had also watched him become a man who had forgotten, somewhere along the way, how to simply be present with another person without armor between them. "There is one thing," she said finally. "Name it. Not medicine, not healers." She drew a slow breath, gathering her strength. "I want you to make me something, Ronan. With your own hands." He frowned, confused. "Anything within my power." "A blanket," she said. "Knitted. By you." For a moment, Ronan thought he had misheard her. He searched her face for some sign that fever had clouded her mind, that she did not mean what she had said, but her eyes were clear and steady, fixed on him with the same quiet determination she had used to guide an entire kingdom through wars and famines during his father's reign. "A blanket," he repeated. "Your father tried, once," Elara said, a faint light entering her tired eyes at the memory. "Long before you were born. He was clumsy with the needles, dropped stitches everywhere, cursed more than any king should. But he tried, because I asked him to, and because he loved me enough to look foolish in the attempt. I still have the scrap he finished, tucked away in my chest of keepsakes. It is crooked and full of holes, and it is one of the things I treasure most in this world." Ronan's throat tightened. He had never known that story. His father had died when Ronan was still a young man learning to hold a sword, and there had been no time for quiet conversations about knitted blankets or small acts of love hidden inside a marriage, forged through duty, and eventually deepened into devotion. "I am not skilled with my hands in that way," he admitted. "I would not know where to begin." "Then learn," Elara said simply. "You have conquered rival packs. You have negotiated peace with kings who wanted your throne. Surely a pair of knitting needles will not defeat you." Despite the ache in his chest, Ronan felt the corner of his mouth twitch, almost a smile. "You ask a great deal, for a dying woman." "I ask a great deal because I am dying," she said, and though her voice held no bitterness, the words struck him harder than any blade ever had. "I do not want gold. I do not want more healers whispering promises they cannot keep. I want to be wrapped in something my son made with his own 2 hands, before I close my eyes for the final time. That is all. That is everything." Ronan lowered his head, pressing his forehead briefly against the back of her hand. The Alpha King, feared across 3 kingdoms, undefeated in battle, found himself utterly unable to refuse a request, so small and so impossible, all at once. "I will do it," he said. "I promise you. I will finish it before—" He could not bring himself to say the words. "Before I am gone," Elara finished gently, without flinching from the truth the way he could not. "Yes, I believe you will." Before he could rise from her bedside, Elara's hand tightened around his once more, holding him in place a moment longer. "There is something else you should understand," she said. "This is not only about the blanket, Ronan. It never was." He looked at her, waiting. "You have spent your whole life learning to be strong for other people," she continued. "For your father's memory, for your soldiers, for a kingdom that expects you to have no doubts and no fear. I have watched you build walls around yourself since the day you took the crown, and I understand why. A king cannot rule from a place of softness, not in these lands, not with the enemies at our borders. But I fear that somewhere in all that strength, you have forgotten how to be patient with yourself, how to fail at something small, and still remain whole." Ronan said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She had always seen through him more clearly than anyone else alive. "Learning to knit will not save my life," Elara said softly. "The healers have already told us that nothing will. But it may teach you something you will need long after I am gone. Patience, humility, the willingness to sit with something difficult until it becomes easy. A king who only knows how to win battles is only half a king. I want you to leave this palace, if only for a short while, and learn something for no reason except love. Not duty, not politics, love." Her words settled into him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through thoughts he had not examined in years. He thought of the countless nights he had spent poring over maps and treaties, the meetings that stretched past midnight, the constant vigilance required to hold a kingdom together against those who circled it like wolves scenting weakness. He could not remember the last time he had done anything, simply because it brought him joy rather than advantage. "I will try," he said finally. "Not because I understand it fully, but because you asked. and because some part of me believes you are right." Ilara's smile deepened, though exhaustion pulled at the edges of it. "That is all I have ever wanted from you. Not perfection. Only honesty and effort." He stayed with her through the evening, long after the candles burned low, and the healers returned quietly to check on her breathing. He said little, only held her hand, and listened as she drifted in and out of sleep, murmuring old memories of his father, of the early years of their reign, of a young Ronan, who had once been small enough to sit upon her lap during court sessions, refusing to be parted from her side. When he finally left her chambers near midnight, the castle was silent, the corridors empty of servants and guards alike. Ronan walked slowly this time, his mind turning over the impossible task ahead of him. He was a king who commanded armies with a single word, who had never once in his life admitted defeat before an enemy. Yet the thought of a simple pair of needles left him feeling more uncertain than he had felt in years. He could not ask his own household for lessons. Word would spread through the castle by morning, and by the following week, it would reach every rival kingdom, watching for any sign of weakness in his rule. An alpha king learning needlework would be seen as scandal, as softness, as an opening for those who wished to challenge his throne. He needed someone outside the palace, someone discreet, someone skilled enough to teach him quickly, because time, as his mother's healers had made painfully clear, was not something he had in abundance. Ronan stood at the window of his own chambers long after the moon had risen high above the pine forest surrounding his lands. Somewhere out there, beyond the walls he had built to protect his kingdom, there had to be someone who could help him keep the promise he had just made. He did not yet know her name. He did not know that within days, his search would lead him to a small cottage at the edge of his territory, to a woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, who would change far more in his life than simply teaching him how to knit. For now, he knew only one thing, with absolute certainty. He would not fail his mother. Whatever it cost him, whatever pride he had to set aside, he would learn to make the blanket she had asked for, stitch by imperfect stitch, before the last of her strength slipped away. He thought of his father then, a man he barely remembered except through stories and the weight of a crown passed down too soon. A king who had once sat somewhere in this very castle, cursing under his breath as threads slipped through clumsy fingers, determined to finish something small and imperfect for the woman he loved. Ronan had spent his whole life trying to live up to the image of a warrior king, a ruler whose name alone could end conflicts before they began. He had never once considered that his father's true strength might have lived in a quieter moment like that one, hidden away from the eyes of the court, meant for no one but his wife. Perhaps that was the lesson his mother wanted him to learn, more than any stitch or pattern. That strength did not always look like victory on a battlefield. Sometimes it looked like humility. Sometimes it looked like a king, willing to fumble through something entirely unfamiliar, simply because someone he loved had asked it of him. Ronan turned from the window at last and called for his most trusted steward, a quiet older man named Edwin, who had served the royal family since before Ronan was born. Edwin arrived within minutes, still dressed despite the late hour, as though he had sensed his king would need him. "I require your discretion," Ronan said, "more than you have ever given me before." Edwin bowed his head. "Always, my lord. I need to find someone outside the castle, a weaver, a seamstress, anyone skilled enough with needle and thread to teach quickly and quietly. No one within these walls can know the reason. Not my council, not the guards, no one." If Edwin found the request strange, he did not show it. Years of service had taught him never to question the private wishes of the family he served. "I will make inquiries at first light, my lord. Discreetly as you ask." "Thank you, Edwin." The old steward hesitated at the door. "May I ask, my lord, if this concerns the Queen Mother?" Ronan's jaw tightened, but he saw no reason to lie to a man who had guarded his family's secrets for decades. "It does." Edwin nodded slowly, understanding passing behind his tired eyes. "Then I will find you the finest hands in the territory, my lord. You have my word." Alone again, Ronan sat by the dying fire in his chambers long into the night, turning his mother's request over and over in his mind. Tomorrow, the search would begin. Tomorrow, an alpha king who had never bowed to fear or exhaustion would step quietly beyond his own walls, seeking a stranger's help with something far smaller than armies or treaties, yet somehow more difficult than anything he had faced in years. The kingdom could wait, his mother could not. Edwin returned before the sun had fully risen, his boots still damp from crossing the dew-covered fields beyond the castle grounds. Ronan had not slept. He stood at the window of his chambers, watching the gray light spread slowly across the pine forests that bordered his territory, when the steward knocked and entered, without waiting for permission, a rare breach of formality that told Ronan the news mattered. "I found someone," Edwin said, his voice low. "A woman named Wren Ashby. She lives alone at the edge of the eastern woods, near the old mill road. The villagers speak of her skill with needle and thread, as though it were something close to magic. Blankets, tapestries, garments fit for nobility, all made by her hands alone. Does she know who requires her services?" "No, my lord. I gave no names, only that a traveler seeks lessons, and is willing to pay generously for discretion." Ronan nodded, relief and unease mixing together in his chest. A stranger. Someone with no ties to the court, no reason to whisper his secret through the halls of Blackwood Castle. It was exactly what he needed, and yet the thought of approaching anyone as a student, stripped of his crown and his authority, unsettled him in ways battle never had. "I will go to her myself," he said. Edwin's eyebrows rose slightly. "My lord, surely someone else could be sent in your place." "No." Ronan's voice left no room for argument. "This is not a task I can hand to another. I made a promise. I intend to keep it with my own hands, from the very first lesson." By mid-morning, Ronan had shed the heavy formal robes of court, and dressed instead in the simple clothing of a traveling merchant, plain wool and leather, nothing to mark him as anything more than an ordinary man. He took no guards, no escort, only a borrowed horse, and the directions Edwin had given him. It felt strange to walk through his own lands unseen, unrecognized, the weight of his crown left behind in a locked drawer. The ride to the eastern woods took the better part of 2 hours, the path winding through dense pine trees, and along the banks of a narrow river that fed into the mill pond near Wren's cottage. Ronan had traveled through every corner of his kingdom during wartime, but he had rarely taken the time to notice the quiet beauty of it during peace. Birds called from the branches overhead. Sunlight broke through the canopy in scattered patches across the forest floor. For the first time in longer than he could remember, no one required anything of him at all. The cottage, when he finally reached it, was smaller than he expected. Built from gray stone, with a thatched roof, and a garden bursting with herbs and late summer flowers along its border. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. A basket of wool sat beside the front door, half sorted into neat-colored piles. Ronan dismounted and approached slowly, unsure suddenly of what to say. He had negotiated treaties with hostile kings. He had stood before armies twice the size of his own without flinching, yet standing before this small door, preparing to ask a stranger to teach him something so foreign to his nature, left him oddly hesitant. He knocked. The door opened moments later, revealing a woman, perhaps a few years younger than himself, her dark hair pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping to frame a face marked by quiet intelligence and clear, assessing eyes. She wore a simple dress dusted with loose threads, and her hands, when she crossed her arms and studied him, were calloused in the particular way of someone who worked constantly with fine, delicate materials. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded, the voice of someone accustomed to strangers appearing at her door with requests. "I was told you are the finest hand with needle and thread in this territory," Ronan said. "I require lessons, as many as it takes to learn quickly." Wren's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him from head to boot, with an assessment that made him feel oddly exposed, as though she could see straight through the plain clothing to something beneath it. Most men who come asking for lessons want to impress a wife or a mother with a gift they claim they made themselves. Which is it for you? "My mother," Ronan said. "She is unwell. I promised her something only I could make." Something in his voice must have carried the weight of the truth, because Wren's guarded expression softened, just slightly, at the mention of illness. She studied him a moment longer, before stepping back from the doorway. "Come in then, quickly, before the flies follow you inside." The interior of the cottage was warm, and cluttered in a way that felt lived in, rather than messy. Shelves lined with spools of colored thread, baskets of wool sorted by shade, half-finished projects draped over the backs of wooden chairs. A small fire crackled in the hearth, despite the mild autumn weather outside. Ren gestured for him to sit at a table near the window, where sunlight fell across a set of knitting needles and a partially finished scarf. I should tell you plainly, she said, settling into the chair across from him. Knitting is not something learned in an afternoon. It takes patience. Most men your size do not seem to possess. Ronan felt something almost like amusement stir beneath his exhaustion. You assume a great deal about a stranger. I assume based on experience, Ren said simply. Large hands, impatient eyes, the look of someone accustomed to commanding rather than listening. I have taught enough students to recognize the type within moments of meeting them. And what type succeeds, in your experience? The ones willing to fail badly, repeatedly, without storming out of my cottage in frustration. A faint, challenging smile touched the corner of her mouth. We shall see which type you are. She handed him a set of needles, simple wooden ones worn smooth from years of use, along with a ball of soft gray wool. Ronan turned the needles over in his hands, feeling suddenly, absurdly clumsy, as though his fingers had forgotten how to perform even basic tasks in the presence of this unfamiliar skill. Watch first, Ren instructed, taking up her own needles and demonstrating slowly, her hands moving with practiced ease, looping thread and guiding stitches with a rhythm that looked almost effortless. The first stitch begins here. You loop the wool around your finger, like so, then guide the needle through. Ronan attempted to mimic her movements, his large fingers fumbling with the thin wooden needles, the wool slipping loose before he could complete a single stitch. He tried again, more slowly this time, only to have the yarn tangle hopelessly around his knuckles. You are gripping the needles as though they were swords, Ren observed, not unkindly, though a faint note of amusement colored her voice. Loosen your hands. This is not a battle. Everything feels like a battle when I am failing this badly, Ronan muttered, more to himself than to her. Ren's lips curved slightly at that admission, though she said nothing further, only reached across the table to adjust his grip, her fingers brushing briefly against his own as she repositioned the needles. The contact was brief, professional, yet Ronan found himself unexpectedly aware of it, a small distraction amid his frustration. They worked through the better part of an hour, Ren patiently correcting his grip, his tension, the angle of his wrists, while Ronan dropped stitches and tangled wool, with a frequency that would have embarrassed him in any other context. Yet something about Ren's steady, unbothered patience made the repeated failures feel less like humiliation and more like simple practice, the same way a soldier might drill the same maneuver 100 times before mastering it. You are not as hopeless as your first attempt suggested, Ren said eventually, examining the small, uneven square of knitting he had managed to produce, riddled with dropped stitches and uneven tension throughout. Clumsy, but not hopeless. There is a difference. High praise, Ronan said dryly. I do not give false praise, Ren replied. If your work were truly hopeless, I would tell you plainly, and save us both the wasted afternoon. Ronan studied her for a moment, this stranger who spoke to him, with none of the careful deference every other person in his life offered, who corrected his mistakes without hesitation, and withheld compliments, unless she believed them fully earned. It was, he realized, strangely refreshing. No one in his court spoke to him this way. No one dared. How long have you lived out here alone? He asked, curious despite himself. Ren's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something guarded passing behind her eyes before she answered. Long enough. My family is gone. This cottage and this craft are what remain to me. She said it plainly, without inviting further questions, and Ronan understood well enough not to press. I will need many lessons, he said instead, returning to the matter at hand. How quickly can you teach someone as clumsy as myself to produce something worth giving to another person? Ren considered this, glancing at the uneven square of gray wool between them. Weeks. If you practice diligently between our lessons. Less, if you are willing to work through frustration, rather than around it. I do not have weeks to spare carelessly, Ronan said. My mother's time is limited. Something in his tone must have carried the weight of true urgency, because Ren's expression softened once more, her earlier guardedness easing just slightly. Then we will work quickly. Come back tomorrow, and the day after. I will teach you as much as your hands can manage to hold. Before he could rise, Ren set down her own needles and studied him a moment longer, curiosity finally overtaking her earlier reserve. You have not told me your name, she said. Or perhaps you would rather I not know it. Ronan hesitated only briefly. A false name would be easy enough to give, and safer, yet something about her directness made the idea of lying to her feel distasteful. Ronan, he said, offering only that. No title, no family name attached. Ronan, she repeated, testing the sound of it. No family name to go with it? Not one I wish to share today. Ren studied him for a long moment, clearly aware that he was withholding something, yet she did not push further. Very well, Ronan with no family name. I suppose most of my students arrive with secrets of one kind or another. Grief tends to make people private. Is that what you believe this is? Grief? I believe a man does not learn to knit at your age, with your hands, unless something has forced the decision upon him, rather than inviting it, Ren said, gathering the scattered wool back into its basket with brisk, practiced movements. Whether that something is grief or love or simple desperation, I have not yet decided. Perhaps it is all three. Ronan said nothing, because she was closer to the truth than she likely realized. He watched her move about the small cottage, tidying the table, banking the fire for the evening, her motions economical and sure, in a way that spoke of years spent alone, managing every task without assistance. You live here entirely by yourself, he said again, not quite a question this time. I manage well enough, Ren replied, though something guarded flickered behind her eyes once more. The village is close enough for trade. I sell my work at the market twice a month, enough to keep the cottage warm through winter, and food on the table. It is a quiet life. I have grown to prefer it that way. You do not miss company? I did not say that. A faint, wry smile touched her mouth. I said I have grown to prefer quiet. There is a difference between preferring solitude and never wishing for company at all. Ronan found himself studying her more closely than the conversation strictly required, noting the tired lines around her eyes that suggested more hardship than she spoke of openly, the careful way she avoided any mention of family beyond the brief admission that they were gone. He recognized, in some small way, a fellow traveler in solitude, someone who had built walls of her own, for reasons she did not readily share with strangers. I should return before dark, he said eventually, aware that lingering longer would only invite questions he was not yet prepared to answer. You have already given me more of your time than I expected. Do not thank me yet, Ren said, rising to see him to the door. You have completed exactly one crooked square of knitting in an entire afternoon. There is a great deal of work ahead, before you have earned any gratitude from me. Ronan rose from the table, as the afternoon light began to shift toward evening. Gathering the borrowed needles and the ball of gray wool Ren pressed into his hands for practice. At the door, he paused, glancing back at her small, cluttered cottage, at the quiet, capable woman who had just agreed to help a stranger she knew nothing about. Thank you, he said simply. You have no reason to trust me, yet you have agreed regardless. Ren shrugged, though something thoughtful lingered in her gaze as she studied him. Anyone willing to look so foolish for their mother's sake cannot be entirely without honor. Tomorrow, then, try not to lose the needles before you return. Ronan rode back toward the castle as dusk settled over the pine forests, his mind turning over the strange events of the day, the unexpected woman who had agreed to help him without knowing the true weight of who he was. For the first time since his mother's diagnosis, he felt something close to hope, small and fragile, threading its way through the exhaustion and grief that had consumed him for weeks. Tomorrow, he would return to the small stone cottage at the edge of his kingdom, and continue the strange, humbling task of learning something entirely new, guided by a stranger who saw only a clumsy, determined man, and not the crown he carried in secret. That evening, back within the castle walls, Ronan visited his mother's chambers before retiring for the night. Elara was awake, propped against her pillows, a cup of warm broth cooling untouched on the table beside her bed. She studied his face as he entered, noting immediately the faint traces of wool clinging to his sleeve. You found someone, she said, not quite a question. A woman named Ren, at the edge of the eastern woods. She agreed to teach me. Ronan settled into the chair beside her bed, showing her the small, uneven square of knitting he had managed to produce, riddled with dropped stitches and crooked edges. Elara took it gently between her thin fingers, examining the imperfect work with an expression of quiet tenderness that Ronan had not expected. It is terrible, she said, laughing softly, the sound weak but genuine. I am aware. It is also perfect, she added, pressing the small square against her chest, as though it already held the warmth of the finished blanket she had requested. Because you made it yourself, out of love, without complaint. That is all I ever wanted, Ronan. Not skill, not perfection, only this. He stayed with her a while longer, recounting small details of the lesson, the stubborn woman who refused to flatter him, the strange, humbling frustration of failing at something so small, after a lifetime of victories. Alara listened with quiet delight, her tired eyes brightening at the description of Ren's sharp tongue and steady patience. She sounds like someone I would like to meet, Alara said eventually, her voice growing heavier with approaching sleep. Perhaps one day, Ronan said, though even as he spoke the words, he wondered how much time truly remained for such a meeting to occur. He left her chambers as the candles burned low, the small square of imperfect knitting left behind, tucked carefully beneath her pillow. Walking back through the quiet castle halls, Ronan found his thoughts returning again and again to the small cottage at the edge of the woods, to sharp eyes and steady hands, and to a promise he intended to keep no matter the cost. By the fourth lesson, Ronan's hands had begun to remember what his mind still struggled to accept. He arrived at Ren's cottage each morning before the sun had fully cleared the treetops, dressed in the same plain traveling clothes, his borrowed horse tied at the edge of the garden, while he ducked through the low doorway into the warm, cluttered space that had slowly become familiar to him. The wool no longer tangled quite so hopelessly around his fingers. The needles no longer felt like foreign objects fighting against his grip. Progress, however small, had begun to show itself in the increasingly even rows of his practice squares. You are improving, Ren said one morning, examining his latest attempt with the same critical eye she applied to everything, though this time, a note of genuine approval colored her voice. Still clumsy in places, but the tension is more even. You are finally listening to your hands instead of forcing them. I had a good teacher, Ronan said. Do not let it go to your head. You still knit like a man, expecting the wool to fight back. Despite her sharp tongue, or perhaps because of it, Ronan found himself looking forward to these mornings more than he cared to admit. There was something freeing about the small cottage, about the hours spent hunched over needles and thread, with no advisors demanding his attention, no treaties requiring his signature, no rival packs testing the strength of his borders. For a few hours each day, he was simply Ronan, a clumsy student struggling to master something entirely new, and Ren treated him with exactly the same bluntness she likely offered every other student who had ever sat at her table. Tell me something, he said, as she guided his hands through a new stitch pattern, her fingers occasionally brushing his own in correction. Why knitting? Of all the crafts you might have learned, why this one? Ren considered the question for a long moment before answering, her attention still focused on his uneven stitches. My mother taught me, when I was young. She said that anger and grief needed somewhere to go, and that busy hands kept a busy mind from dwelling too long on things it could not change. She paused, something distant entering her expression. After she and my father were gone, I kept knitting, because it was the only thing that still felt like her presence in the room. I am sorry, Ronan said quietly, for your loss. It was years ago, Ren replied, though her voice carried a weight that suggested the grief had not fully faded, despite the passage of time. I have made my peace with it, mostly. The cottage, the craft, the quiet life I have built here. It is enough. It has to be enough. Something in the resignation of her words struck Ronan more deeply than he expected. He recognized, uncomfortably, echoes of his own recent months, the careful way he had begun preparing himself for a loss he could not prevent, building walls of duty and distraction around a grief that threatened to consume him if he allowed it even a moment's foothold. Sometimes enough is simply what we tell ourselves until it becomes true, he said. Ren glanced up at him then, something searching in her gaze, as though she were reconsidering the stranger seated across her table. That is a strange thing for a merchant to say. Ronan's jaw tightened slightly at the near slip. He had told her only his first name, allowed her to assume he traveled in trade, some minor dealer of goods with enough coin to pay generously for private lessons. The lie had been necessary, yet it sat increasingly uncomfortable against his conscience the longer their lessons continued. I have seen a great deal of loss in my line of work, he said carefully. Trade routes cross through difficult places, One learns things about grief, watching others carry it. Ren studied him a moment longer, clearly unconvinced by the vague explanation, though she did not press further. Well, however you came by such wisdom, you are not wrong. Enough is simply what we decide it must be, until the deciding becomes easier than the alternative. They continued the lesson in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the small fire and the soft click of needles meeting wool. Ronan found himself studying her more closely than the lesson strictly required. The furrow of concentration between her brows, the quiet competence in every movement of her hands, the occasional flash of dry humor that broke through her guarded exterior when he made a particularly clumsy mistake. "You are staring," Ren observed, without looking up from her own work. "I am concentrating," Ronan corrected. "You are staring at me, not at your knitting, which explains why your last 3 stitches are uneven enough to embarrass a child just learning the craft." Ronan glanced down to find she was entirely correct, his row of stitches tangled and inconsistent where his attention had drifted. He felt an unfamiliar warmth rise in his face, something he could not recall experiencing in years. A king unaccustomed to being caught so plainly in a moment of distraction. "My apologies," he said. "The pattern of the wool caught my attention." "The pattern of the wool is gray, plain, and entirely unremarkable," Ren said dryly, though the corner of her mouth twitched with something close to amusement. "Try again, and this time, keep your eyes where they belong." He obeyed, though it took considerable effort to redirect his focus fully to the needles in his hands, rather than the woman seated across from him. Something had shifted between them over the past several lessons, subtle and unspoken, a gradual thawing of Ren's initial guardedness into something closer to easy familiarity. She still corrected him bluntly, still refused false praise, yet the sharpness that had once colored every interaction had softened into something more like teasing, the natural rhythm of 2 people who had grown comfortable enough with each other to speak plainly. As the lesson continued into the early afternoon, Ren finally set aside her own work entirely, watching as Ronan completed an entire row without a single dropped stitch, his tension finally even, his rhythm settling into something approaching genuine skill. "There," she said, satisfaction evident in her voice. "That is what competent knitting looks like. Remember that feeling. Return to it whenever your hands grow impatient again." Ronan examined the row himself, a small, unfamiliar pride swelling in his chest at the simple accomplishment. It was such a small thing, an even row of stitches in plain gray wool, yet it felt more meaningful than any victory he had won on the battlefield, precisely because it had been so difficult to achieve, precisely because it had required him to fail repeatedly before finally succeeding. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more sincerely than he had meant those words in a long while. Ren studied him for a moment, something thoughtful passing behind her sharp eyes. "You keep thanking me as though this were some great gift I am giving you, rather than a simple exchange of coin for lessons." "Perhaps it is both," Ronan said. Something shifted in her expression at that, a flicker of uncertainty breaking briefly through her usual composure, though she recovered quickly, returning her attention to her own abandoned knitting. "Do not grow sentimental on me, Ronan with no family name. We still have a great deal of work ahead before your mother receives anything worth giving." "How long, do you think? Truly?" Ren considered the question seriously this time, examining his progress with a critical professional eye. "If you continue practicing as diligently as you claim, and if your hands continue improving at this rate, perhaps 3 more weeks before you could attempt something as ambitious as a full blanket. Sooner, if you are willing to practice every evening between our lessons, not simply when convenient. 3 weeks. Ronan did the calculation silently, weighing it against the healer's careful, uncertain estimates of how much time his mother truly had remaining. It would be close, perhaps too close. Yet he had no choice but to trust the process, to continue showing up each morning, hands clumsy but improving, determined to finish what he had promised no matter how narrow the window became. "I will practice every evening," he said, "whatever it takes." "Good." Ren handed him a fresh ball of wool, richer and softer than the practice yarn they had used thus far, a deep blue that shimmered faintly in the afternoon light. "This is finer material than what we have practiced with. Take it home, practice with something that matters, so your hands grow accustomed to the weight and texture of what you will eventually use for the true blanket." Ronan accepted the wool carefully, running his thumb across its soft, expensive fibers. This is generous of you. It is practical, Ren corrected, though something in her tone suggested more warmth than she cared to admit. A student who practices with poor material develops poor habits. I would rather you learn correctly from the beginning. Before packing away the practice yarn, Ren showed him one final technique for the day, a slightly more complicated stitch that would give the finished blanket texture and warmth beyond simple flat rows. She demonstrated slowly, twice, before handing the needles back to him and watching closely as he attempted to replicate the motion. His first attempt was clumsy, the stitch collapsing halfway through into a tangle of loose thread. His second attempt fared little better. Ren said nothing, only watched with patient, steady attention, allowing him the space to work through the frustration building visibly in his shoulders. You are gripping too tightly again, she said finally, when his third attempt ended in the same tangled failure. Whenever you grow frustrated, your hands remember old habits. Breathe. Loosen your grip. The wool is not your enemy. It feels like my enemy at the moment, Ronan muttered, resisting the urge to fling the needles across the room in frustration, an impulse he had not felt so strongly since he was a boy first learning swordsmanship under his father's exacting eye. Everything feels like an enemy when you refuse to be patient with yourself, Ren said, echoing, without realizing it, words strikingly similar to those his mother had spoken during their first conversation about the blanket. You are not failing because you lack skill. You are failing because you expect mastery after only a handful of lessons. That is not humility. That is impatience dressed up as high standards. Ronan set down the needles, studying her for a long moment. You speak as though you understand exactly what troubles me. I have taught enough students to recognize the pattern, Ren said, though something in her gaze suggested she saw more in him than she was willing to admit aloud. Powerful people, accustomed to excelling at everything they attempt, often struggle most with crafts like this one, precisely because failure is unfamiliar to them. You are not the first merchant who has sat at this table expecting quick mastery. You will likely not be the last. Merchant, Ronan repeated quietly, the word settling strangely against his conscience once more. Is that not what you are? Ren asked, a note of genuine curiosity entering her voice for the first time, as though she sensed something evasive in his hesitation. Ronan considered, for a brief moment, whether to finally reveal the truth of who he was, the crown he carried, the kingdom he ruled, beyond these quiet woods. Yet the thought of disrupting the fragile, easy comfort that had grown between them over the past several lessons held him back. He was not yet ready to see the guarded caution return to her expression, the careful deference that would inevitably follow the revelation of his true identity. Something close enough to a merchant, he said finally, the evasion sitting uncomfortably on his tongue. Ren studied him a moment longer, clearly aware that his answer had skirted the full truth, though she chose not to press further. Whatever you are stubborn enough to keep returning despite your frustration. That, at least, speaks well of you. She guided his hands through the difficult stitch once more, her patience unwavering despite his repeated failures, until finally, on his sixth attempt, the pattern held, the stitch forming correctly beneath his fingers for the first time. A small, unexpected surge of pride swelled through him at the simple accomplishment, entirely disproportionate to the smallness of the achievement, yet deeply satisfying regardless. There, Ren said, genuine warmth entering her voice. You see, patience rewarded, eventually. I begin to understand why you value this craft so deeply, Ronan admitted. There is something honest about it. No amount of authority or wealth can force the wool to cooperate before it is ready. Precisely, Ren said, something like approval brightening her expression. The wool does not care who you are, outside these walls. It only responds to patience and practice, regardless of title or fortune. The words landed with unexpected weight, given the secret he still carried, unspoken between them. As the afternoon light began to fade, Ronan gathered his things to depart, the deep blue wool tucked carefully alongside his needles. At the door, Ren paused him with a light touch to his arm, an unusual gesture from a woman who had maintained careful distance throughout their previous lessons. Your mother is fortunate, she said quietly, to have a son willing to work so hard for something so small, yet so meaningful. She would say the same of you, Ronan replied, for agreeing to teach a stranger, without asking for anything beyond fair payment. Ren's hand lingered a moment longer against his arm before she withdrew it, something unreadable passing behind her expression. Tomorrow then, same time, bring the blue wool, and we will begin practicing the pattern you will eventually need for the finished piece. Ronan rode back toward the castle, as dusk settled over the pine forests, the deep blue wool resting carefully in his saddlebag, his mind turning over the strange warmth that had begun to grow between himself and the sharp-tongued woman who had agreed to teach him. He did not yet understand what it meant, this quiet pull he felt toward her company, this reluctance to leave her small cottage each afternoon. He knew only that something had shifted, subtle yet undeniable, over the past several days of lessons, and that whatever waited ahead, both for his mother and for himself, would be more complicated than he had first imagined. The howl came just as the sun began slipping behind the western tree line. Ronan had stayed later than usual that day, the lesson stretching into early evening, as Ren guided him through the final stages of a practice pattern, meant to mirror the border design of the finished blanket. He was packing away his needles, the deep blue wool coiled neatly at the bottom of his bag, when the sound rose sharp and unnatural through the quiet forest air, a cry that carried none of the rhythm of an ordinary wolf's call. Ren froze at the sound, her hands stilling over her own work. "That is not a normal howl," she said, her voice low. Ronan's senses sharpened instantly, old instincts rising to the surface despite weeks spent playing the role of a clumsy merchant. He knew that cry. It was the sound of a rogue wolf, likely driven mad by hunger or sickness, wandering beyond its own territory, in search of anything vulnerable enough to attack. "Stay inside," he said, rising quickly from the table. "What is happening?" Ren asked, alarm creeping into her voice, as she moved toward the window, peering out into the deepening shadows of the forest beyond her small garden. "A rogue," Ronan said. "Dangerous, and likely close." He moved toward the door, every instinct honed through years of battle screaming at him, to assess the threat before it reached the cottage. "You cannot simply walk outside," Ren said, catching his arm. "Whatever that creature is, it sounds enormous." Ronan hesitated only a moment, weighing the risk of revealing more of himself than he had intended, against the danger of allowing the threat to reach her unguarded cottage. The choice, in the end, was no choice at all. "Whatever you hear, do not come outside." He stepped into the cooling evening air, just as a massive shape burst from the tree line at the edge of the garden, fur matted and wild, eyes wild with the particular madness that came from prolonged isolation and disease. The rogue wolf was easily twice the size of an ordinary animal, its shifter nature evident in the unnatural proportions of its limbs, saliva foaming at its jaws as it fixed its gaze on the cottage. Ronan did not hesitate. Years of discipline and training took over instantly, his own shift beginning before conscious thought could interfere, bones and muscle rearranging with practiced speed, as his human form gave way to the massive, powerful wolf that had earned him the title of Alpha King across 3 kingdoms. Within seconds, he stood transformed, his fur dark as midnight, his frame dwarfing even the wild proportions of the rogue before him. The rogue wolf hesitated at the sight of him, some instinctive recognition of dominance registering even through its madness, before desperation overcame caution, and it lunged forward regardless. Ronan met the charge head-on, his greater strength and discipline evident in every controlled movement, redirecting the rogue's momentum and pinning it swiftly against the earth, without inflicting more harm than necessary to subdue it. The fight lasted only moments, Ronan's superior training and raw power ending the confrontation before it could escalate further. The rogue, finally recognizing the futility of continued struggle, went still beneath him, whimpering with the particular defeat of a creature that had exhausted itself entirely. Ronan held it pinned a moment longer, ensuring the danger had truly passed, before releasing his hold and allowing the rogue to flee back into the depths of the forest, chastened and unlikely to return. He shifted back to his human form slowly, breathing hard from the brief but intense exertion, and turned toward the cottage to find Ren standing frozen in the doorway, having disobeyed his instruction to remain inside. She stared at him with wide eyes, her earlier alarm now transformed into something closer to shock, the realization of what she had just witnessed, settling visibly across her features. "You are a shifter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and not an ordinary one." Ronan approached slowly, aware of how thoroughly his secret had just unraveled, aware, too, that there was no way to explain away the raw power she had just witnessed firsthand. "Ren." That was no common wolf, she continued, backing slightly away from him despite the danger having passed entirely. I have seen shifters before, in the village, ordinary folk who transform for hunting or defense. I have never seen anything of that size, that strength. I can explain, Ronan said, though even as he spoke the words, he recognized how inadequate they sounded, given the magnitude of what remained unexplained. Ren studied him for a long, tense moment, her earlier fear slowly giving way to something more complicated. A mixture of confusion and wary curiosity. You told me you were a merchant. I did, Ronan admitted. Merchants do not possess strength capable of subduing a rogue wolf twice their size without visible effort. No, Ronan agreed quietly. They do not. The silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, the evening air cooling rapidly around them, as the last light faded from the sky. Ronan watched Ren carefully, searching for some sign of how she intended to proceed, whether fear or anger would win out over the fragile trust they had built across the past several lessons. I am not going to hurt you, he said finally, when the silence grew too heavy to bear. Whatever else remains unexplained, please believe that much. Ren's shoulders relaxed slightly at that, though wariness remained evident in her posture. Then explain the rest. All of it. I deserve that much, given what I have just witnessed on my own doorstep. Ronan considered how much to reveal, weighing the risk of full honesty against the safety of continued deception. Yet standing before her in the fading light, having just displayed strength he could no longer hide, further lies felt both futile and deeply wrong, given everything she had already offered him without question. My name is Ronan, he said. That much was true, but I am not a merchant. I am an alpha, considerably stronger than most, born to a bloodline that carries greater strength than ordinary shifters possess. An alpha, Ren repeated slowly, studying him with renewed intensity, pieces clearly beginning to assemble themselves behind her sharp eyes. Of what pack? What territory? Ronan hesitated only a moment longer before answering, aware that the full truth would change everything between them, yet unwilling to compound his earlier deception with further evasion. This territory, he said quietly. All of it. I did not lie about my mother's illness, Ren. Everything about that remains entirely true, but I did not tell you that she is the queen mother of this kingdom, or that I am the king who rules it. Ren went very still, the color draining slightly from her face as the full weight of his revelation settled over her. You are the Alpha King, she said, her voice flat with disbelief. The king I have heard spoken of in the village, feared across 3 territories, said to command entire packs with a single word. Yes. And you have spent the past several days sitting at my table, failing repeatedly at simple knitting, allowing me to correct your grip and scold you for poor tension, without once mentioning that you rule the very land my cottage sits upon. Yes, Ronan admitted again, aware of how thoroughly the confession damaged whatever trust had grown between them. Ren's expression hardened, hurt and anger flashing plainly across her features. You lied to me, repeatedly, for days. I did not know how else to approach this, Ronan said, aware of how inadequate the explanation sounded even as he offered it. A king seeking knitting lessons would become scandal within hours if discovered. I needed discretion, and I feared that revealing my identity from the beginning would change how you treated me, how honestly you corrected my mistakes. So you decided deception was preferable to honesty, Ren said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. You decided I did not deserve the truth about who was sitting at my table, drinking my tea, learning from my hands. That was never my intention. Intention matters little when the outcome is the same, Ren interrupted, stepping back further into her doorway, putting distance between them that felt far heavier than the physical space it represented. I do not know what to make of any of this, Ronan, or whatever your name truly is, beyond that single, apparently honest detail. The rogue wolf's earlier attack, dangerous as it had been, suddenly felt less threatening than the fracture now visible in Ren's expression. The careful trust she had extended to a stranger, now revealed as something far more complicated, far more consequential, than either of them had anticipated when their lessons first began. I understand if you no longer wish to continue teaching me, Ronan said quietly, bracing himself for the answer he feared was coming. Ren studied him for a long moment, conflicting emotions warring visibly behind her guarded expression. I do not know what I wish, at this moment, she said finally. I need time to consider what any of this means. Go home, Ronan. Whatever your true name and title, go home tonight, and allow me to think clearly without your presence complicating matters further. Ronan nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in her request even as it pained him to leave things so unresolved. I will return tomorrow, if you are willing to see me. If not, I will understand, and find another way to keep my promise to my mother. He mounted his horse and rode back toward the castle, beneath a sky now fully dark, the events of the evening weighing heavily upon him, the rogue wolf's attack already fading in significance compared to the far more complicated confrontation that had followed it. Somewhere behind him, in her small cottage at the edge of the forest, Wren Ashby sat alone with the unsettling knowledge that the clumsy merchant she had grown genuinely fond of teaching was, in truth, the most powerful man in the entire kingdom. Whether she would forgive the deception remained, for now, entirely uncertain. The ride back to Blackwood Castle felt longer than usual, the darkness pressing close around the narrow forest path, Ronan's thoughts circling endlessly around the look on Wren's face when the truth had finally settled over her. He had faced down armies without a flicker of doubt, negotiated with kings who wished him dead, yet the memory of her hurt expression unsettled him more thoroughly than any battlefield ever had. He arrived at the castle to find Edwin waiting near the stables, the old steward's expression shifting to concern the moment he noticed the tension evident in his king's posture. "My lord, is something wrong? You look as though you have fought a war rather than attended a knitting lesson." "A rogue wolf attacked near the cottage," Ronan said, dismounting slowly, exhaustion settling heavily into his limbs, now that the danger and confrontation had passed. "I dealt with it, but in doing so, I revealed more of myself than I intended." Edwin's brow furrowed with understanding. "She knows who you are, then." "She does." Ronan handed the reins to a waiting stable hand, his mind still turning over the conversation that had followed his transformation. "And she is, understandably, troubled by the deception." "Will she continue the lessons?" "I do not know," Ronan admitted. "She asked for time to consider matters. I intend to respect that request, however difficult it proves." Edwin studied his king for a long moment, something thoughtful entering his expression. "If I may speak plainly, my lord, deception rarely serves well in matters of the heart, even when the intention behind it is honorable." Ronan glanced sharply at his steward. "This is a matter of knitting lessons, Edwin, not affairs of the heart." "Of course, my lord," Edwin said, though the faint knowing look in his eyes suggested he believed otherwise. "Forgive my assumption." Ronan said nothing further, though Edwin's words lingered uncomfortably as he made his way through the quiet castle corridors toward his mother's chambers. He found Alara awake, despite the late hour, propped against her pillows, a single candle burning low on the table beside her bed. "You look troubled," she observed the moment he entered, her keen eyes missing nothing despite her illness. "A complication arose today," Ronan said, settling into the familiar chair beside her bed. He recounted the events plainly, the rogue wolf's attack, his necessary transformation, and the subsequent unraveling of the careful deception he had maintained throughout his lessons with Wren. Alara listened quietly, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "You feared her reaction to your true identity," she said, once he had finished. "That is why you hid it from the beginning. I feared she would treat me differently, cautiously, the way everyone else does, once they learn who I truly am. And now she knows regardless, and you fear you have lost something valuable in the manner of the telling, rather than the telling itself." Alara's voice remained gentle, despite the directness of her observation. Ronan said nothing, though the accuracy of her words settled heavily in his chest. "Give her time," as she asked, Alara continued. "A woman capable of teaching a king patience through knitting needles is likely capable of forgiving an honest mistake, made from fear rather than malice. But you must be prepared to earn that forgiveness honestly, Ronan, not simply expect it, because circumstances require her continued cooperation." "And if she refuses to continue teaching me?" "Then you will have learned an important lesson regardless," Alara said, though sadness touched her voice as she spoke. "That honesty offered too late sometimes costs more than honesty withheld entirely. I hope, for both your sakes, that this is not the case here." Ronan stayed with his mother a while longer, the conversation gradually shifting to quieter, gentler topics, memories of his father, old stories from his childhood that Alara seemed to draw increasing comfort from, as her strength continued its slow decline. When he finally left her chambers, the candle had burned nearly to its base, and exhaustion weighed heavily upon him, both from the physical exertion of the earlier confrontation and the emotional weight of everything that had followed. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether Ren would welcome him back to her cottage or turn him away entirely, her trust too thoroughly damaged by his careful, well-intentioned deception. He knew only that he would return regardless, prepared to accept whatever judgment she offered, because the promise to his mother remained unchanged, and because some part of him, quiet and unfamiliar, hoped desperately that Ren Ashby might find it within herself to forgive him. Ronan returned to the cottage the following morning, uncertain of what awaited him. He had barely slept, his mind cycling endlessly between the memory of Ren's hurt expression and his mother's fading strength, two burdens that pulled at him from opposite directions with equal weight. He dressed once more in plain traveling clothes, though the disguise felt hollow now, a formality maintained more from habit than genuine concealment, given that the woman he intended to visit already knew precisely who he was. The cottage looked the same as always when he arrived, smoke curling from the chimney, the garden still bursting with late summer color despite the cooling autumn air. Yet everything about approaching it felt different this time, weighted with an uncertainty he had not carried through the doorway on any previous visit. He knocked, and waited. The door opened after a long moment, Ren standing in the frame with an expression far more guarded than he had grown accustomed to over the past several lessons. She studied him silently, making no move to invite him inside, and Ronan understood that whatever forgiveness might eventually come, it would not arrive easily, or quickly. "I did not know if you would open the door," he admitted. "I considered not answering at all," Ren replied, her voice carrying less warmth than it had before yesterday's revelation. "But I decided that whatever else has changed between us, running from the conversation would solve nothing." She stepped back, allowing him inside, though the easy familiarity of previous visits remained noticeably absent. Ronan entered the small cottage and found himself suddenly unsure where to sit, whether the chair at her table remained his to claim after everything that had unfolded. "Sit," Ren said, gesturing toward the familiar seat, though her tone carried none of the teasing warmth he had grown fond of. "We have a great deal to discuss before any further lessons take place." Ronan settled into the chair, watching as she took her own seat across from him, her posture stiff and formal in a way that felt entirely foreign after the easy comfort they had built together. "I spent the night considering everything," Ren began, her hands folded tightly before her. "The lies, the reasons behind them. Whether I could continue teaching a man who deceived me so thoroughly for the sake of his own comfort." "It was never about my comfort," Ronan said quietly. "I feared how the truth would change your treatment of me. I did not want deference, or careful handling, or the caution everyone else offers once they learn my title. I wanted honest instruction, honest correction. I feared losing that the moment you learned who I truly was. So instead, you took the choice away from me entirely," Ren said, her voice sharpening slightly. "You decided, on my behalf, what I could and could not handle knowing. That is not protection, Ronan. That is control, dressed up as consideration." The accusation struck harder than Ronan expected, precisely because he recognized the truth buried within it. He had spent so long controlling every variable within his kingdom, every threat, every negotiation, that the instinct to control even something as small as Ren's perception of him had come naturally, without conscious deliberation. "I did not consider it that way at the time, but you are right. I took from you the choice to decide how you wished to treat me, based on complete information. That was wrong of me, regardless of my intentions." Ren studied him for a long moment, something in her expression softening slightly at the sincerity of his admission. "You are the first person of power I have ever met willing to admit fault so plainly, without excuse or deflection. I have had considerable practice failing at things recently," Ronan said, a faint, rueful note entering his voice. "Knitting has proven an effective teacher of humility." Despite herself, the corner of Ren's mouth twitched slightly, though she quickly suppressed the reaction, unwilling to let the tension between them dissolve too easily. "This is not something to make light of." "I am not making light of it," Ronan said, his tone growing serious once more. "I understand the weight of what I did. I understand that trust, once damaged, does not repair itself simply because the one who damaged it apologizes sincerely. I am prepared to accept whatever judgment you offer, Ren. If you no longer wish to teach me, I will find another way to keep my promise to my mother. But I hope, if it is possible, that you might reconsider. Ren was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window, toward the garden beyond where autumn had begun creeping steadily into the edges of her herbs and flowers. Why does it matter so much to you? Whether I forgive you, whether I continue teaching you, you could find another instructor easily enough, given your resources. Why does my particular forgiveness carry such weight? Ronan considered the question carefully, aware that his answer mattered more than he had initially realized. Because these past weeks, sitting at your table, failing repeatedly at something so simple, have been the only hours of genuine peace I have known since my mother's illness began. Because you treated me as an ordinary man, capable of failure and improvement in equal measure, rather than a king who must never show weakness. I do not wish to lose that, Ren, not simply for the sake of finishing the blanket, but because I have come to value your company beyond the lessons themselves. The words hung between them, more honest than Ronan had intended to be, yet true regardless. Ren's expression shifted subtly, surprise flickering behind her guarded eyes at the depth of his admission. That is a considerable confession, she said quietly, for a man who withheld his own name for weeks. I am attempting to correct that pattern, Ronan said. Starting now, with complete honesty, regardless of how uncomfortable it proves. Ren studied him a moment longer, something in her posture finally beginning to ease, the rigid formality softening into something closer to her usual thoughtful consideration. I will not pretend the deception did not hurt, she said. It did, more than I expected, given how briefly we have known each other. But I recognize, too, the difficult position you found yourself in. A king cannot simply announce himself without consequence, even in matters as small as knitting lessons. Does this mean you are willing to continue? Ronan asked, hope entering his voice despite his attempt to remain composed. It means I am willing to consider it, Ren said, though something almost like warmth had returned to her expression. On the condition that there be no further secrets between us. Whatever remains of your true circumstances, whatever complications your position brings to these lessons, I wish to know them plainly, rather than discovering them through rogue wolf attacks or other unexpected revelations. Agreed, Ronan said immediately, relief flooding through him at her willingness to continue despite everything. Complete honesty. From this moment forward. Ren nodded slowly, reaching for the abandoned knitting needles still resting on the table between them. Then let us continue where we left off. Ronan Blackwood, Alpha King of these lands. Though I confess, addressing you by full title feels considerably strange, given how thoroughly you have embarrassed yourself with a simple pair of knitting needles these past several days. Ronan felt something loosen in his chest at her attempt at humor, the first sign that perhaps their fragile connection might yet survive the damage of his earlier deception. You may continue calling me simply Ronan, if it suits you better. I find I prefer it, coming from you. Careful, Ren said, though warmth had fully returned to her voice now. A king asking a common seamstress for such familiarity might raise questions, should anyone discover the nature of these lessons. Let them discover it, Ronan said, surprising himself with the conviction behind the words. I find I care considerably less about court gossip than I once believed possible. Before picking up the needles again, Ren hesitated, studying him with renewed curiosity now that the barrier of his hidden identity had finally fallen away. May I ask you something, now that pretense no longer stands between us? Anything, Ronan said. Why does an Alpha King, capable of commanding entire packs, feel the need to learn this craft himself? Surely you could summon any seamstress in the kingdom to your castle, compel their silence through royal decree, and spare yourself the indignity of traveling here in disguise each morning. Ronan considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer mattered to her beyond simple curiosity. My mother did not ask for a blanket made by skilled hands, he said. She asked for one made by my hands specifically. The imperfection is the point, Ren. My father attempted something similar, long ago, and failed rather badly by all accounts. Yet she treasures that failed attempt more than any finely woven garment gifted to her since. She wants to hold something clumsy and imperfect, made entirely from love rather than skill. Ren's expression softened further at this explanation, understanding passing visibly behind her thoughtful eyes. That is a rare kind of wisdom, for a woman facing her own mortality. Most people, facing what she faces, might ask for grand gestures, elaborate gifts, proof of devotion measured in gold or ceremony. My mother has never valued such things, Ronan said. She ruled this kingdom for decades beside my father, yet she always maintained that the smallest, most private gestures carried more weight than any public display of wealth or power. I did not fully understand this until recently. Watching her illness progress has taught me a great deal about what truly matters, in the end. And has it changed how you rule? Or merely how you view her? Ronan paused, considering the question more deeply than he initially expected to. I do not yet know, he admitted. I have spent my entire reign building strength through discipline and control, ensuring no weakness could be exploited by rivals or enemies. These lessons, this failure and slow improvement, have shown me something I had forgotten. That vulnerability, honestly offered, does not necessarily invite exploitation. Sometimes it simply invites connection. Ren studied him a long moment, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet cottage air. That is a dangerous lesson for a king to learn too openly, she said finally, though her tone carried no true warning, only quiet acknowledgement. Perhaps, Ronan agreed, yet I find myself unwilling to unlearn it, regardless of the risk. The silence that followed felt different from their earlier tension, warmer somehow, charged with an understanding neither had fully articulated yet, both clearly recognized. Ren finally broke the moment, reaching once more for the abandoned knitting needles, though something in her manner had shifted permanently, the careful distance she had maintained throughout the morning, finally dissolving into genuine warmth. Come, she said, whatever else remains complicated between a king and a common seamstress, the blanket still requires finishing, and your mother's time remains limited. Let us not waste further hours dwelling on matters neither of us can fully resolve today. They resumed the lesson slowly, the earlier tension gradually dissolving into something closer to their previous comfortable rhythm, though a new awareness had settled between them now, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had fully named yet both recognized regardless. Ronan's hands moved more steadily than before through the familiar stitches, guided by Ren's patient corrections, while outside the small cottage windows, autumn continued its slow, steady march toward the winter that would eventually claim his mother's remaining strength entirely. For now, though, there was only the quiet cottage, the soft click of needles, and the fragile, rebuilding trust between a king who had learned humility through failure, and a woman who had learned, despite herself, to care for the clumsy stranger who had once knocked so uncertainly upon her door. When Ronan finally departed as evening approached, Ren walked him to the edge of her garden rather than simply closing the door behind him as she had on previous visits. The autumn air had turned crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys, and the first stars had begun appearing faintly above the tree line. Tomorrow, she said, bring the blue wool. We have wasted enough time on complications. Your mother deserves to see progress, not delay. Tomorrow, Ronan agreed, mounting his horse with a lightness he had not felt in weeks. Thank you, Ren, for considering forgiveness, even when I gave you little reason to extend it so readily. Do not mistake consideration for full forgiveness, Ren said, though warmth softened the words considerably. You have earned a second chance, Ronan Blackwood. Whether you earn complete trust remains to be seen, through actions rather than apologies alone. A fair judgment, Ronan said. I intend to prove myself worthy of it. He rode back toward the castle beneath the emerging stars, his heart considerably lighter than it had been that morning, though the weight of his mother's illness remained ever present beneath the fragile joy of Ren's renewed trust. Upon arriving at Blackwood Castle, he found Edwin waiting once more near the stables, the steward's weathered face creasing with quiet relief at the sight of his king's improved demeanor. Matters resolved favorably, my lord? More favorably than I had any right to expect, Ronan admitted, dismounting and handing over the reins. Though I suspect the true test still lies ahead. He visited his mother's chambers briefly before retiring, finding her weaker than the previous evening, her breathing more labored, though her eyes remained sharp and attentive as he recounted the day's events. She listened with quiet delight to his description of Ren's careful, conditional forgiveness, her thin hand squeezing his own with surprising strength at certain details. She sounds like a woman of considerable character, Alara said softly, once he had finished, to forgive so thoughtfully, without surrendering her own dignity in the process. She is unlike anyone I have known, Ronan admitted. Good, Alara said, her voice growing heavier with approaching sleep. "You deserve someone unlike anyone you have known, Ronan. Your father was such a person to me, once. I am glad to see you finding something similar, however complicated the path toward it may prove." Ronan stayed until she drifted fully into sleep, the candle burning low beside her bed, before finally retiring to his own chambers, his mind full of blue wool and sharp eyes, and the fragile, rebuilding trust that had somehow survived a day that could easily have ended everything before it truly began. The soldier arrived at Ren's cottage before Ronan did the following morning, his royal insignia gleaming against dark armor as he dismounted hurriedly in the small garden. Ren had been tending her herbs when the rider approached, and she straightened warily at the sight of him, uncertain what business a royal guard might have at her humble doorstep. The soldier, a young man with anxious eyes, bowed briefly before addressing her. "Forgive the intrusion, madam. I am searching for the king. His steward believed he might be found in this area." Ren's stomach tightened at the words, the implications settling over her rapidly. Whatever careful discretion Ronan had maintained regarding his visits had apparently begun unraveling beyond her cottage walls as well. "The king is not here," she said carefully, though the timing of Ronan's expected arrival made the lie feel precarious at best. The soldier's expression tightened with evident urgency. "Madam, this is a matter of considerable importance. The Queen Mother's condition has worsened significantly overnight. The healers fear she may not have as much time as previously believed. His Majesty must be found immediately." Before Ren could respond further, hoofbeats sounded from the forest path, and Ronan himself emerged into the clearing, still dressed in his customary plain traveling clothes, unaware of the guard awaiting him, until it was too late to maintain any pretense of anonymity. The soldier's eyes widened, with obvious relief and confusion in equal measure, as he took in his king's unusual attire. "Your Majesty, I did not expect to find you dressed as—" He trailed off, clearly uncertain how to address the peculiar circumstances. "What news?" Ronan demanded, dismounting swiftly, all pretense of casual disguise forgotten in the face of the soldier's evident urgency. "The Queen Mother, Your Majesty. Her condition has worsened considerably since last evening. The healers believe you should return immediately." Ronan's face paled visibly, the color draining as quickly as it had upon hearing similar news weeks earlier. "I will ride at once." He turned briefly toward Ren, apology and regret evident in his expression despite the urgency of the moment. "I am sorry. I must go." "Of course," Ren said immediately. "Go to her. We will continue lessons whenever circumstances allow." Ronan mounted swiftly, riding hard alongside the soldier back toward the castle, leaving Ren standing alone in her garden with the unsettling knowledge that whatever privacy had once protected their unusual arrangement had now begun crumbling in earnest. Word would spread quickly through the castle, through the surrounding villages, that the Alpha King had been discovered in disguise, visiting a common seamstress under mysterious circumstances. She was right to worry. By the following afternoon, whispers had already begun circulating through the market square nearest her cottage, villagers speculating openly about the nature of the king's secret visits to the mysterious woman living at the forest's edge. Ren heard the rumors firsthand, while selling her wares, customers exchanging knowing glances and pointed questions about her relationship with the crown. She had risen early that morning, loading her cart with finished shawls and carefully wound skeins of dyed wool, following the same routine she had maintained for years, selling her work at the village market to support her quiet life at the cottage. The market itself sat nestled along the main road leading toward Blackwood Castle, stalls crowded together beneath colorful awnings, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread and roasting chestnuts despite the early hour. Normally, Ren's presence at the market drew little attention beyond customers seeking her well-known skill with needle and thread. That morning, however, she noticed the shift immediately, conversations pausing as she passed, eyes following her with a curiosity that had nothing to do with her wares. A young woman named Elsie, who ran the bakery stall beside Ren's usual spot, leaned close as Ren arranged her display. "You have caused quite a stir, my dear," Elsie said, her tone more amused than accusatory. "The whole village speaks of nothing else this morning." "I do not know what you mean," Ren said, though the careful neutrality of her voice likely fooled no one familiar with her usual candor. "Come now," Elsie pressed gently. "A merchant seen riding to your cottage nearly every day for weeks, only to be revealed as the Alpha King himself, dressed in disguise? The story has traveled faster than any gossip I have heard in years. Wren's hands stilled over her display of wool, the full weight of how quickly the truth had spread finally settling over her. It is not what the rumors suggest, she said carefully. He required lessons, nothing more. Lessons in what, precisely? Elsie asked, one eyebrow raised with obvious skepticism. Wren hesitated, uncertain how much remained hers to share. Uncertain, too, whether protecting the truth about Alara's illness and Ronan's promise would only fuel further speculation rather than quiet it. That is not mine to discuss, she said finally. Whatever the king requires from me remains between the two of us, and I would ask that you not press further. Elsie studied her a long moment, something knowing softening her earlier teasing tone. Whatever it truly is, my dear, be careful. Kings and common folk rarely mix well in stories that end happily. I say this as a friend, not to wound you. The warning settled uncomfortably in Wren's chest as she continued her morning at the market, customers approaching with poorly disguised curiosity rather than genuine interest in her craft. Questions about the king's visits woven awkwardly into requests for shawls and blankets. By midday, exhausted by the constant scrutiny, Wren packed her remaining wares and returned home earlier than usual, the walk back to her cottage feeling considerably longer than the familiar path warranted. Alone in her cottage that evening, she found herself staring at the half-finished blue blanket resting on her work table, the pattern Ronan had been slowly mastering across their recent lessons, and wondered for the first time whether continuing their arrangement was truly wise, whatever feelings had grown between them, regardless of the widening gossip. A king and a seamstress. The village already whispered of scandal. She could only imagine what the nobility within Blackwood Castle itself might be saying, and the thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Meanwhile, within Blackwood Castle, the whispers had taken a far more dangerous turn. They say the king has been seen riding to your cottage nearly every day, one older woman remarked, her tone carrying more curiosity than malice, though the implications remained uncomfortable regardless. What business could an alpha king possibly have with a seamstress, if not something considerably more personal than simple trade? Wren offered no direct answer, uncertain herself how much of the truth remained hers to share, though the growing rumors troubled her considerably as she made her way home that evening. Meanwhile, within Blackwood Castle, the whispers had taken a far more dangerous turn. Ronan's council, gathered hastily upon his return, addressed the matter with considerably less delicacy than the villagers had shown. Your Majesty, began Lord Castellan, one of his most senior advisers, his tone carefully measured, though clearly troubled. Word has reached us that you have been visiting a common woman outside the castle walls, disguised as a merchant. Such behavior, whatever its explanation, raises serious concerns among the nobility regarding your judgment during this critical period. My mother requested a gift only I could provide, Ronan said, his patience already strained thin from exhaustion and worry over Alara's declining condition. The details of how I chose to fulfill that request are my own concern, not the council's. With respect, Your Majesty, nothing involving the king's conduct remains solely his own concern, Lord Castellan pressed. Rival packs have already begun circulating rumors that you are distracted, perhaps compromised, during a period when the kingdom requires steady, visible leadership. Alpha Kestrel of the Eastern Territories has specifically referenced these rumors in recent correspondence, suggesting your attention has strayed from matters of true importance. Ronan's jaw tightened at the mention of Alpha Kestrel, a longtime rival whose ambitions toward Blackwood territory had simmered beneath diplomatic courtesy for years. Kestrel seeks any excuse to challenge my authority. This is merely his latest attempt. Perhaps, another advisor interjected, an older woman named Lady Pharaoh, whose counsel Ronan had long respected. But the timing proves unfortunate, regardless of Kestrel's true motivations. Your mother's illness already weakens perception of the crown's stability. Rumors of a secret romantic entanglement with a common seamstress, however innocent the true circumstances, provide exactly the narrative rival packs need to question your fitness to rule during this transition. There is no romantic entanglement, Ronan said, though even as he spoke the denial, he recognized its incompleteness given the feelings that had begun growing steadily throughout his lessons with Wren. Whether true or merely perceived matters little to those seeking justification for aggression, Lord Castellan said. We strongly advise Your Majesty that you cease these visits immediately, at least until your mother's situation has fully resolved, and the kingdom's stability no longer depends so heavily on unquestioned confidence in your leadership." Ronan sat in tense silence, weighing the political reality his advisors presented against the promise he had made to his dying mother, against feelings for Ren that had grown far deeper than he had initially anticipated or intended. The council's concerns were not unfounded, he recognized reluctantly. A kingdom already unsettled by the Queen Mother's illness could ill afford additional instability, particularly with rivals like Alpha Kestrel actively seeking pretense for aggression. "I will consider your counsel," he said finally, though the words tasted bitter, given everything they threatened to cost him. "Consider it swiftly, Your Majesty," Lord Castellan urged. "Alpha Kestrel has requested a formal audience within the week. Whatever explanation you intend to offer regarding these rumors, it must be prepared and convincing before that meeting occurs." The council dispersed eventually, leaving Ronan alone, with thoughts that pulled him in directions he could not easily reconcile. His duty to his kingdom demanded caution, discretion, perhaps even the complete abandonment of his visits to Ren's cottage until the current political tension eased. Yet his promise to his mother, and the feelings he had developed for Ren despite his best efforts to maintain professional distance, resisted such simple political calculation. He visited Alara's chambers that evening, finding her considerably weaker than even the previous day, her breathing shallow and labored despite the healer's best efforts to ease her discomfort. She managed a faint smile upon seeing him, though the effort of even that small expression seemed to cost her considerable strength. "You look troubled," she observed, her voice barely above a whisper now. Ronan settled beside her bed, taking her frail hand carefully in his own. "The council has learned of my visits to Ren. Rumors have spread through the kingdom, and rival packs seek to exploit the perceived scandal." "And what do you intend to do?" Alara asked, her keen eyes remaining sharp despite her physical decline. "I do not know," Ronan admitted. "Caution suggests I should end the visits, at least temporarily, until matters settle. But the blanket remains unfinished, and I fear ending things with Ren now would damage something I have only just begun to understand the value of." Alara studied her son for a long, quiet moment, gathering what strength remained to her. "Ronan," she said finally, her voice weak but resolute, "I have ruled this kingdom, alongside your father, for decades. I have seen countless political crises manufactured from nothing more than fear and rumor. Do not let Kestrel's ambitions dictate choices that matter far beyond politics. The council fears the kingdom's stability, Mother. Not simply my personal happiness. The kingdom's stability depends on a king secure enough in himself to withstand petty rumors without abandoning what matters to him," Alara said, her words carrying surprising force despite her physical weakness. "I did not raise you to be ruled by fear of gossip, Ronan. Whatever you decide regarding Ren, decide it based on your own conscience, not Kestrel's manufactured outrage." Ronan sat with her words, long after leaving her chambers that night, torn between the practical concerns his council had raised and his mother's fierce insistence that he not surrender to manufactured political pressure. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, in her small cottage at the forest's edge, Ren sat late into the night beside her own small fire, the half-finished blue blanket spread across her lap as she considered Elsie's gentle warning. She did not regret teaching Ronan, did not regret the strange, careful friendship that had grown between them across weeks of failed stitches and quiet conversation. Yet the growing weight of the kingdom's attention pressed uncomfortably against the simplicity she had built her life around, and she wondered, staring into the flickering firelight, whether the coming days would bring resolution or ruin to the fragile thing they had built together. She thought of Alara, a woman she had never met, yet felt she understood in some small way, through Ronan's careful descriptions of his mother's wisdom and gentle strength. She thought of the blanket itself, still incomplete, representing a promise that mattered more than any political scandal brewing within the castle walls. Whatever the council demanded, whatever rival packs whispered about weakness and distraction, Ren found herself hoping, quietly and against her better judgment, that Ronan would choose to finish what he had started, both with the blanket and with her. The coming days would test not only the fragile trust they had rebuilt, but the very stability of the kingdom Ronan had sworn to protect. Alpha Kestrel arrived at Blackwood Castle 3 days later than his formal audience had originally required, a deliberate insult that Ronan recognized immediately for the calculated provocation it represented. The Eastern Alpha entered the Great Hall flanked by 4 of his own guards, his posture radiating the particular arrogance of a man who believed circumstances had finally shifted in his favor. Kestrel was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark eyes calculating as they swept across the assembled court, lingering perhaps a moment too long on Ronan's face, searching for some sign of the weakness rumors had promised him. "Alpha King Ronan," Kestrel said, his bow shallow, barely meeting the minimum requirements of courtesy between rulers. "I trust your kingdom remains as stable as ever, despite recent distractions." "My kingdom remains precisely as stable as it has always been," Ronan replied evenly, refusing to grant Kestrel the satisfaction of visible irritation. "What business brings you to Blackwood territory, Kestrel?" "Your correspondence mentioned matters of some urgency." Kestrel's smile widened slightly, predatory beneath its practiced civility. "Merely concerns shared among neighboring territories, Your Majesty. Concerns regarding leadership, and whether certain personal entanglements might compromise a king's judgment during periods requiring particular clarity and strength." The implication landed clearly across the assembled court, murmurs rippling through nobles and advisors alike, who had gathered to witness the exchange. Ronan felt his jaw tighten, old battlefield discipline the only thing preventing visible anger from breaking through his composed exterior. "Speak plainly, Kestrel, or do not speak at all," Ronan said. "I have little patience for veiled insinuations dressed as diplomatic concern." "Very well," Kestrel said, his tone shifting toward open challenge. "The entire region speaks of an Alpha King, disguising himself as a common merchant, visiting a seamstress at the forest's edge, nearly every day for weeks. Some suggest romantic entanglement. Others suggest something more troubling, perhaps evidence that grief over your mother's illness has clouded your judgment beyond safe limits for a ruler of your position." "My personal affairs are not the Eastern Territory's concern," Ronan said, his voice carrying the low, dangerous edge that had silenced armies far larger than the small gathering assembled in his hall today. "Perhaps not, under ordinary circumstances," Kestrel pressed, undeterred by the warning evident in Ronan's tone. "Yet these are not ordinary circumstances, Your Majesty. A kingdom whose leadership appears distracted, whose ruler's judgment seems questionable, invites challenge from those who might otherwise respect established borders. I merely suggest, as a neighboring ruler concerned for regional stability, that you clarify these matters swiftly, before other parties conclude that Blackwood territory has grown vulnerable during this transition." The threat, thinly veiled beneath diplomatic language, registered clearly across the hall. Lord Castellan shifted uncomfortably beside Ronan's throne, his earlier warnings about exactly this scenario now proving distressingly accurate. "Are you threatening my territory, Kestrel?" Ronan asked directly, cutting through the careful diplomatic phrasing that had characterized the exchange thus far. "I am merely observing circumstances, Your Majesty," Kestrel said, though his smile suggested considerable satisfaction at having provoked such a direct question. "Circumstances that other ambitious rulers throughout these lands are undoubtedly observing as well. Whether those observations lead to action depends entirely on how convincingly you address the concerns currently circulating." Ronan studied his rival for a long moment, weighing the political reality of the challenge against everything his mother had urged him to consider the previous evening. Kestrel wanted a reaction, wanted evidence of instability he could use to justify aggression against Blackwood territory, wanted Ronan to either deny the rumors so vehemently that it revealed genuine anxiety, or confirm them in a manner that suggested distraction from matters of rule. "My mother, the Queen Mother Elara, is dying," Ronan said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "She asked me, before her illness claims her entirely, to provide her with a single gift made by my own hands. I sought instruction from a skilled craftswoman to fulfill that request. There is no scandal here, Kestrel, only a son honoring his dying mother's final wish." The admission, spoken plainly before the entire court, seemed to catch Kestrel momentarily off guard, his calculating expression flickering with something like surprise before recovering into practiced neutrality. "A touching sentiment, Your Majesty," he said, though his tone carried less conviction than his earlier provocations. Yet sentiment alone rarely satisfies those questioning whether a distracted king remains fit to defend his borders. "My borders remain precisely as defended as they have always been," Ronan said, his composure returning fully now that the truth had been spoken aloud. "I would remind you, Kestrel, that whatever personal matters occupy my private hours, my strength and my kingdom's stability remain entirely unchanged. Should you doubt this, I invite you to test it directly, rather than relying on rumor and insinuation to accomplish what direct challenge clearly does not. The threat, returned now with equal directness, settled heavily across the hall. Kestrel studied Ronan for a long moment, calculating whether the bluff, if it was one, was worth calling. Eventually, something in Ronan's unwavering expression seemed to convince him otherwise. "I meant no true challenge, Your Majesty," Kestrel said, his tone retreating slightly toward diplomatic caution. "Merely concern, as I said, for regional stability during a difficult transition. I wish your mother comfort in her remaining time, and trust that whatever personal matters you attend to will not further compromise the strength this kingdom has always maintained." "Your concern is noted," Ronan said coolly, "as is the manner in which you chose to express it, before my entire court, rather than through private correspondence as diplomatic custom typically requires." Kestrel's jaw tightened slightly at the pointed observation, recognizing the subtle rebuke embedded within Ronan's response. "Perhaps custom was not fully observed in this instance," he acknowledged stiffly. "I trust future exchanges between our territories will proceed with greater discretion." "I trust they will," Ronan replied, "given that Blackwood territory remains, as always, considerably stronger than any rival, foolish enough to test its borders, based on rumor alone." The exchange concluded shortly after, Kestrel departing the hall with his guards in considerably less confident posture than he had arrived with, the calculated provocation having failed to yield the reaction he had clearly hoped to provoke. Yet as the great hall slowly emptied following the tense audience, Lord Castellan approached Ronan, with expression still troubled despite the apparent successful resolution. "You handled that admirably, Your Majesty," Castellan said, "yet I fear Kestrel's departure does not fully resolve the underlying concern. Other territories will hear of this exchange. Some may conclude, regardless of your composed response, that the rumors themselves indicate vulnerability worth exploiting. Then let them test that conclusion directly," Ronan said, "rather than relying on whispered gossip to accomplish what open challenge apparently will not." "And Wren Ashby?" Castellan asked carefully. "Given today's public admission regarding your reasons for visiting her, will you continue the arrangement, despite the attention it has now drawn?" Ronan considered the question seriously, weighing everything that had unfolded across recent weeks against the political reality his advisors continued to emphasize. "I made a promise to my mother," he said finally. "I do not intend to abandon it now, regardless of Kestrel's provocations or the court's discomfort with public scrutiny." "And your feelings for the woman herself?" Castellan pressed gently, showing rare boldness in raising such a personal matter directly. "Forgive my presumption, Your Majesty, but today's exchange suggested considerably more than simple gratitude for instruction." Ronan said nothing for a long moment, the weight of Castellan's observation settling uncomfortably against his usual careful composure. "That is a matter I have not yet fully resolved within myself," he admitted finally. "Regardless, my mother's wish remains unchanged, and I intend to honor it fully, whatever complications arise from doing so." Word of the confrontation reached Wren's cottage by early evening, carried by a traveling peddler who had witnessed the exchange firsthand while delivering goods to the castle kitchens that morning. He recounted the tale to a small gathering near the village well, embellishing certain details while remaining largely faithful to the substance of what had transpired. And by the time the story reached Wren second-hand through a neighbor's excited retelling, the king's public admission regarding his mother's illness and his reasons for seeking knitting lessons had already spread throughout the surrounding countryside. Wren sat quietly at her work table that evening, the half-finished blue blanket spread across her lap, processing the strange sensation of hearing something so personal, something she had believed private between herself and Ronan, now recounted as common gossip among strangers. She felt no anger at the revelation, only a complicated mixture of vulnerability and something close to pride, that Ronan had chosen honesty before his entire court, rather than denial or evasion. Yet alongside that pride sat genuine worry. If Alpha Kestrel had felt bold enough to challenge Ronan publicly regarding rumors of their arrangement, others throughout the region would likely draw similar conclusions, testing whether the Alpha King's apparent distraction indicated true vulnerability worth exploiting. Wren understood little of political maneuvering among rival packs, yet she understood enough to recognize that her small, quiet life had somehow become entangled in matters considerably larger than knitting lessons and blankets meant for a dying queen. She wondered, staring into the low fire crackling in her hearth, Whether Ronan would decide the political cost of continuing their arrangement had grown too steep. Whether tomorrow might bring word that circumstances required him to step back from lessons that had begun as something simple, and had grown, gradually, and against both their better judgments, into something considerably more complicated. He left the great hall shortly after, retreating to the quiet of his own chambers, as the weight of the day's confrontation finally settled fully over him. Kestrel's challenge, though repelled successfully today, represented only the opening move in what would likely prove a longer, more sustained pressure campaign, testing whether grief and personal complication had truly weakened Blackwood Territory's stability during this vulnerable transition. Yet even as political concerns pressed heavily upon him, Ronan found his thoughts returning repeatedly to Wren, to the small cottage at the forest's edge, where the truth of his mother's illness, spoken now openly before the entire court, would inevitably reach her as well. He wondered how she would receive the news that their private arrangement had become subject to political scrutiny at the highest levels, wondered whether the growing pressure might finally convince her that continuing their lessons carried risks neither of them had fully anticipated when their strange arrangement first began. That evening, he visited his mother's chambers to find her resting more peacefully than she had in days, though her strength continued its steady, inevitable decline. He recounted the day's confrontation with Kestrel, watching her expression shift through concern and eventual quiet pride, as he described defending both his kingdom's stability and the honesty of his reasons for seeking Wren's instruction. "You spoke the truth before your entire court," Elara said softly, once he had finished. "That took considerable courage, Ronan, more than facing Kestrel's veiled threats directly." "I did not see another path forward," Ronan admitted. "Denying the rumors entirely would have felt like abandoning the truth of what you asked of me. Yet confirming them risked exactly the political vulnerability Castellan feared." "And which do you regret less?" Elara asked, her keen eyes studying him despite her evident exhaustion. "Neither," Ronan said, after a moment's consideration. "I regret only that circumstances required such a public reckoning at all, rather than allowing this to remain the private, meaningful thing it began as." Elara's hand found his, weak but steady, in a gesture of comfort, despite her own considerable suffering. "Some things, once meaningful enough, cannot remain entirely private forever," she said. "Perhaps this was always going to become known eventually, regardless of how carefully you attempted discretion. What matters now is not whether the world knows, but how you choose to proceed despite that knowledge." Ronan sat with her words long into the evening, uncertain what tomorrow would bring, uncertain whether Wren would view the day's public confrontation as further evidence that their arrangement invited too much complication, too much risk, for whatever fragile connection had grown between them across recent weeks. He knew only that Kestrel's challenge, however successfully repelled today, represented merely the beginning of a larger test, one that would require him to choose, eventually and decisively, between political caution and the promise he had made to honor his mother's final wish, regardless of the cost. Sleep did not come easily that night. Ronan lay awake long after the castle had quieted, replaying Kestrel's calculated provocations alongside his mother's gentle insistence that he not surrender to manufactured political pressure. He thought of Wren, undoubtedly hearing by now the story of his public admission, and wondered what she made of it, whether she felt exposed by the sudden attention, or perhaps something closer to relief, that the truth no longer required careful concealment. Near midnight, he rose from his bed and walked to the window overlooking the eastern woods, the direction of Wren's small cottage, invisible in the darkness, yet fixed clearly in his mind regardless. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of torchlight and castle walls, a woman who had taught him patience through failure now found herself unwittingly drawn into the machinery of kingdoms and rival ambitions far larger than either of them had anticipated when their lessons first began. He resolved, standing there in the quiet darkness, that whatever Kestrel or the council demanded, he would not abandon either his mother's wish or the fragile connection he had built with Wren, simply to satisfy political convenience. Tomorrow, he would ride to her cottage as he had every day before, and whatever consequences followed from that choice, he would face them directly, rather than allowing fear of rumor to dictate matters that mattered more deeply than any throne. Ronan summoned his full council the following morning, delivering a decision that left even the most seasoned advisors momentarily speechless. "I intend to bring Wren Ashby to the castle," he announced, standing before the assembled nobles with the same unwavering composure he had employed against Kestrel's provocations days earlier. She will complete my instruction here, at my mother's bedside, so that the Queen Mother might witness the final stages of the blanket's creation, before her strength fails entirely. Lord Castellan's expression tightened with visible alarm. Your Majesty, surely you understand the risk such a public gesture represents. Bringing this woman openly into the castle only confirms every rumor Kestrel and others have used to question your judgment. I understand the risk perfectly well, Ronan replied evenly. I have also considered it thoroughly, and concluded that hiding this arrangement any longer serves no purpose, beyond feeding speculation that discretion alone cannot silence. My mother's time grows shorter each day. I will not spend her remaining hours managing rumors, rather than honoring the promise I made her. And if Kestrel interprets this as further evidence of distraction, Lady Farrow asked, though her tone carried less alarm than Castellan's, more careful consideration of the practical implications. Then he will learn, as he learned during our audience, that Blackwood territory's strength does not waver based on my personal choices, Ronan said. I have spent years building a reputation through discipline and strength. I do not believe that reputation crumbles simply because I choose honesty over concealment regarding a private matter of family devotion. The council remained divided, several advisors continuing to voice concern throughout the lengthy discussion that followed. Yet Ronan's resolve remained unshaken. He had spent the previous sleepless night weighing every possible consequence, and had concluded, with the same clarity he brought to matters of war and diplomacy, that continuing to hide his connection to Ren served only to validate the very weakness his rivals hoped to exploit. By mid-morning, he rode to Ren's cottage himself, accompanied this time by a small honor guard, rather than traveling in disguise, the pretense of anonymous merchant visits abandoned entirely, now that the truth had become common knowledge throughout the kingdom. Ren met him at her door, clearly having heard something of yesterday's confrontation with Kestrel, her expression uncertain as she took in the formal guard accompanying him. You look considerably more royal than usual, she observed, though tension colored her attempt at humor. I have come to ask something significant of you, Ronan said, dismounting and approaching her slowly. My mother's condition worsens daily. I fear we no longer have the luxury of continuing lessons here, at this pace, given how little time remains. Ren's expression shifted toward genuine concern. What are you asking, Ronan? Come to the castle, he said. Complete my instruction there, at my mother's bedside if necessary, so that whatever time remains to her, she might witness the progress herself, rather than waiting for a finished gift she may not live to receive. The request hung heavy in the autumn air between them, Ren clearly recognizing the magnitude of what he proposed, the public nature of such an arrangement, the scrutiny it would invite from every corner of the kingdom, already whispering about their connection. You understand what this means, she said slowly, bringing me to the castle openly, after everything that occurred with Kestrel, after the rumors that have already spread through every village within a day's ride. I understand precisely what it means, Ronan said. I have spent the entire night considering the political cost, the rumors it will fuel, the ammunition it provides, rivals seeking any excuse for aggression. I have concluded that none of it matters as much as ensuring my mother receives this gift, while she still draws breath to appreciate it. Ren studied him for a long moment, something complicated passing behind her sharp eyes, weighing her own comfort and safety against the urgency of his request. And what of my own reputation, Ronan? I am a common seamstress. Whatever protection your crown offers you, I possess no such shield against whatever consequences follow from this. The question struck him with unexpected force, forcing him to confront a consideration he had perhaps not weighed as carefully as he should have, amid his focus on political strategy and his mother's dwindling time. You are right to raise this, he admitted. I have thought considerably about the risks to my own position, and perhaps too little about what this exposure might cost you personally. Then consider it now, Ren said, though not unkindly, merely with the directness that had characterized their relationship from its very first lesson. Ronan paused, genuinely reflecting before answering. I will ensure you are protected, whatever occurs. Formal royal patronage, if you wish it, acknowledgement of your skill and service, that no rival gossip could easily undermine. Whatever safety my position can extend to you, I will provide unreservedly. That is a generous offer, Ren said. Yet it does not fully answer whether I wish to accept the complications that will inevitably follow, regardless of whatever protection you extend. No, Ronan agreed. That answer remains entirely yours to determine. Ren was quiet for a long moment, gazing past him toward the castle visible faintly in the distance beyond the tree line, weighing considerations that extended far beyond simple knitting lessons now. Your mother's time matters more than my comfort, she said finally. I will come, Ronan. Not because the political complications no longer concern me, but because I have come to care deeply about ensuring she receives what you promised her, however much complexity that choice invites into my own quiet life. Relief flooded through Ronan at her decision, though gratitude tempered by genuine awareness of the sacrifice she was making on his mother's behalf. Thank you, he said simply. I will not forget what you are risking by agreeing to this. They departed together within the hour, Ren gathering only essential supplies, her needles and finest wool, a small bag of personal belongings, before joining Ronan's small procession back toward Blackwood Castle. The journey passed largely in silence, both of them aware of the magnitude of what awaited them within those walls, the court's scrutiny, the whispered judgments that would inevitably follow her arrival. Upon reaching the castle, Ren found herself immediately the subject of curious, assessing stares from servants and nobles alike, gathered along the courtyard and corridors, as word spread rapidly that the mysterious seamstress from the eastern woods had arrived openly at the king's side. Ronan guided her through the halls with quiet reassurance, his presence alone seeming to discourage the more openly hostile whispers that might otherwise have greeted her. They proceeded directly to Alara's chambers, where the Queen Mother lay propped weakly against her pillows, her breathing shallow, but her eyes brightening considerably at the sight of the two of them entering together. So this is the woman who has taught my son such humility, Alara said, her voice weak but warm, studying Ren with evident curiosity and approval in equal measure. Ren curtsied respectfully, though something in Alara's gentle expression seemed to ease her earlier nervousness considerably. Your Majesty, I am honored to finally meet you, though I wish it were under gentler circumstances. Circumstances rarely arrange themselves as gently as we might wish, Alara said, a faint smile touching her tired features. Come, sit beside me. I understand there remains a blanket to finish, and considerably less time than any of us would prefer to finish it properly. Ren settled into the chair beside Alara's bed, drawing out her needles and the deep blue wool that represented weeks of patient instruction, while Ronan took his own seat nearby, watching the two women who had come to matter so deeply to him settle into easy conversation, despite having only just met. Over the following hours, Ren guided Alara through gentle observations about the pattern's progress, while Ronan practiced the final, most intricate portions of the border design under both women's careful supervision, working diligently to ensure the gift reached completion before his mother's remaining strength failed entirely. That evening, after Alara had finally drifted into exhausted sleep, Ronan escorted Ren to the quarters he had arranged for her within the castle, a modest but comfortable room near the eastern tower, chosen deliberately for its distance from the more heavily trafficked halls where nobles gathered to exchange gossip. You handled the court stairs admirably today, he said, as they walked slowly through the quieting corridors. I know it cannot have been easy, arriving somewhere so unfamiliar, under such scrutiny. I have faced worse than curious stares, Ren said, though weariness colored her voice more than she likely intended to reveal. Still, I confess I had not anticipated quite this level of attention. Every servant I pass seems to already know precisely who I am and why I have come. Word travels quickly within these walls, Ronan admitted. I am sorry for the burden it places on you. Do not apologize, Ren said, stopping to face him directly in the dim torchlight of the corridor. I chose to come, Ronan. Whatever complications follow, I made that choice freely, understanding the risks involved. Your mother's kindness today only confirms that the choice was the right one. Something in her steady conviction settled a portion of the guilt Ronan had carried since first proposing this arrangement. She has taken to you remarkably quickly, he observed. She rarely extends such immediate warmth to strangers. Perhaps she recognizes something familiar in me, Ren said, a faint, thoughtful smile touching her lips. A woman accustomed to managing difficult circumstances with whatever grace remains available to her. They reached her chambers, and Ronan lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary at the threshold, reluctant to part for the evening, despite the lateness of the hour. Thank you, he said finally, "for everything you have sacrificed to be here." "Do not thank me yet," Ren replied, echoing words she had spoken to him weeks earlier during their very first lesson, though warmth rather than sharpness colored her tone this time. "We still have a blanket to finish, and precious little time remaining to finish it properly." Ronan left her at her door with something lighter in his chest than the day's political tensions had allowed him to feel in weeks, and made his way back toward his own chambers, grateful beyond measure that she had chosen, despite every reasonable concern, to remain by his side through whatever remained of this difficult chapter. The lessons continued this way for several days, Ren remaining within the castle at Ronan's insistence, despite the persistent whispers that followed her through every corridor, while Alara's condition continued its slow, inevitable decline. Yet something in those quiet hours spent together, king and seamstress and dying queen gathered around a half-finished blanket, felt like precisely the kind of devotion Alara had originally hoped to inspire in her son, proof that strength sometimes revealed itself most clearly through patience, vulnerability, and the willingness to risk political convenience for something considerably more meaningful. Not everyone within the castle shared Alara's warmth toward the arrangement, however. Several nobles, emboldened by Kestrel's earlier public challenge, began voicing their discomfort more openly as the days passed, their objections carried in careful whispers through the halls whenever Ren walked past. Lord Castellan, though he had not withdrawn his professional counsel entirely, maintained a visibly strained politeness whenever circumstances required him to acknowledge her presence directly. Ren bore the scrutiny with the same quiet dignity she had shown from her very first lesson with Ronan, refusing to let the whispers alter her focus on the task that had brought her to the castle in the first place. She spent her mornings at Alara's bedside, guiding both mother and son through the final, delicate stages of the blanket's pattern, and her afternoons largely alone in her modest chambers, avoiding the more crowded corridors where curious stares proved most persistent. Ronan, for his part, made a point of walking with her, openly through the castle whenever their schedules allowed, a deliberate gesture, meant to signal his continued support, regardless of the court's discomfort. It did little to silence the whispers entirely, yet it offered Ren some measure of protection, the unspoken understanding that whatever judgment the nobility harbored privately, none dared voice it directly in the king's presence. By the end of the week, the blanket itself had grown considerably closer to completion, its deep blue expanse now marked by the careful, increasingly confident stitches Ronan had learned to produce under Ren's patient guidance, while Alara's strength continued its steady, unstoppable decline toward whatever time remained to her. The final stitch proved more difficult than any that had come before it, not because the pattern itself was complicated, but because Ronan's hands trembled with an emotion he had not anticipated as the blanket neared true completion. 10 days had passed since Ren arrived at the castle, 10 days of quiet mornings spent at Alara's bedside, the Queen Mother's strength diminishing steadily, despite the healer's best efforts to ease her final weeks with whatever comfort remained available to them. She slept more now than she woke, her lucid hours growing shorter with each passing day, yet she insisted, whenever consciousness allowed, on being present for the blanket's progress, watching with quiet, fierce attention, as her son's clumsy early stitches gradually transformed into something approaching genuine skill. "You are nearly finished," Ren observed one evening, examining the blanket spread across Ronan's lap, its deep blue expanse now bordered by an intricate pattern of interlocking knots that had taken him the better part of a week to master fully. "Perhaps 2 more evenings of work, if your pace continues." 2 evenings, Ronan repeated softly, glancing toward his mother's sleeping form, her breathing shallow and irregular in the candlelit chamber. He did not voice the fear pressing heavily against his chest, that 2 evenings might prove more time than she had remaining to her. Ren seemed to understand the unspoken worry regardless, her hand finding his own where it rested against the half-finished blanket, offering silent comfort rather than empty reassurance she could not honestly provide. "We will work through the night if necessary," she said quietly. "Whatever time remains, we will ensure the blanket is ready before it matters most." They worked steadily through the following 2 days, Ronan's fingers moving with increasing confidence through the complicated final pattern Ren had taught him, while Alara drifted in and out of consciousness beside them, occasionally rousing enough to offer quiet encouragement, or simply watch with tired, loving eyes as her son labored diligently over the gift she had requested weeks earlier. Earlier that same day, before the final stitches had begun, Edwin had approached Ronan quietly, in the corridor outside Alara's chambers, his weathered face carrying an expression of cautious concern. "My lord," he said, "the council grows increasingly restless. Word has reached them that the seamstress remains within the castle, working closely at the Queen Mother's bedside. Lord Castellan requests a private audience before matters progress further." "Tell Castellan the audience will wait until my mother's blanket is finished," Ronan replied, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Whatever concerns the council harbors, they will keep until I have honored the promise that matters most." Edwin bowed slightly, though something like quiet approval flickered behind his tired eyes. "Understood, my lord. I will relay your response, though I suspect it will not entirely satisfy him." "Little satisfies Castellan these days beyond certainty and control," Ronan said, "and I fear I have very little of either to offer him at present." The steward departed without further comment, leaving Ronan to return to his mother's chambers, where Wren waited patiently beside the nearly finished blanket, unaware of the political tension building steadily beyond the quiet room's walls. He said nothing of Castellan's request to her that evening, unwilling to let political concerns intrude upon what remained of his mother's precious, dwindling time. By the second evening, only a small section remained incomplete, a narrow border along the blanket's final edge, that Wren assured him required no more than an hour's careful work to finish properly. Ronan sat beside his mother's bed as the candles burned low, his exhausted hands moving methodically through stitch after stitch. Wren seated close beside him, offering quiet corrections whenever his tension grew uneven from fatigue. "You have come remarkably far," she said softly, watching him work through the final rows. "From a man who could not hold the needles properly to this, your mother should be proud, whatever else remains uncertain." "I could not have managed any of it without you," Ronan said, not looking up from his work, though the sincerity in his voice carried clearly regardless. "You have given me something far more valuable than simple instruction these past weeks, Wren." She said nothing immediately, though the warmth in her expression when he finally glanced up suggested she understood precisely what he meant. The growing feelings, neither of them had fully named, yet both recognized clearly by now. "We should finish," she said finally, her voice slightly unsteady. "Your mother deserves to see this completed, while she still has strength to appreciate it fully." Ronan nodded, returning his attention to the final stitches, his hands steady, despite the emotional weight, pressing against his chest. As midnight approached, he completed the last row, tying off the final knot with careful, practiced fingers that bore little resemblance to the clumsy hands that had first attempted this craft weeks earlier, at Wren's small cottage table. He held the finished blanket before him for a long moment, examining the work in its entirety. Deep blue wool, bordered by intricate knotted patterns, imperfect in places where his early inexperience showed through, despite Wren's patient corrections, yet complete, whole, made entirely by his own hands from beginning to end. "It is finished," he said quietly, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to conceal. Wren studied the blanket alongside him, genuine pride evident in her expression. "It is beautiful, Ronan. Imperfect in places, as your mother requested, yet beautiful regardless." Ronan rose carefully from his chair and approached his mother's bedside, gently rousing her from sleep with a soft touch to her shoulder. Ilara's eyes fluttered open slowly, confusion giving way to recognition as she registered her son standing before her, the finished blanket held carefully in his hands. "Mother," Ronan said softly, "it is finished. I have kept my promise." Ilara's eyes widened slightly, tears gathering at their corners as she took in the sight of the completed blanket, deep blue and warm, made entirely by her son's own hands, as she had requested weeks earlier. "Let me see it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ronan unfolded the blanket carefully and draped it over her, tucking the soft wool gently around her frail frame, watching as she pressed her fingers against the fabric, tracing the imperfect stitches with something close to reverence. "It is exactly as I hoped," Ilara said, tears now flowing freely down her weathered cheeks, though her expression carried nothing but pure, unguarded joy. "Crooked in places, imperfect exactly as your father's attempt was imperfect, made entirely from love rather than skill. This is precisely what I wanted, Ronan. Precisely." Ronan knelt beside her bed, overcome by emotion he had rarely allowed himself to express so openly throughout his life as king. "I am glad," he said, his voice rough. I am glad you have it in time. Ilara's hand found his, gripping with surprising strength despite her evident exhaustion. You have given me more than a blanket, my son. You have shown me that the man I raised still carries the same tender heart I remember from your childhood, despite the crown and the discipline, and the walls you have built around yourself these many years. Her gaze shifted toward Ren, who stood quietly nearby, tears of her own gathering unbidden at witnessing the tender scene unfolding before her. And you, Ilara continued, her voice growing weaker, but no less warm. You have helped him remember that tenderness. I owe you a debt I cannot properly repay. Ren Ashby. You owe me nothing, Your Majesty, Ren said softly, moving closer to the bed. Watching this, being part of it, in whatever small way I have been, is repayment enough. Ilara studied the two of them for a long, quiet moment, something knowing and deeply satisfied entering her tired expression, despite her evident pain. I see how you look at each other, she said finally, her words carrying the particular directness that only the dying seem to fully claim as their right. Do not let politics or rumor or fear convince either of you that what has grown between you these past weeks is anything less than precious. Promise me this, Ronan. Promise me you will not let Kestrel's ambitions or the court's discomfort determine whether you pursue what your heart has clearly already decided. Mother. Promise me, Ilara insisted, her grip tightening once more around his hand, despite her obvious exhaustion. Ronan glanced toward Ren, finding her own expression uncertain yet hopeful, waiting for his answer with an intensity that matched his mother's insistence. I promise, he said finally, the words carrying weight beyond simple comfort offered to a dying woman. Whatever complications arise, I will not abandon what has grown between us, out of fear or political convenience. Ilara's exhausted smile deepened at his answer, satisfaction settling fully across her weathered features. Good, she whispered, her voice growing fainter as exhaustion finally overcame her. Good. Now let me rest, wrapped in this beautiful, imperfect gift my son has made me. I believe I will sleep more peacefully tonight than I have in many weeks. She drifted into sleep shortly after, the finished blanket wrapped snugly around her frail form, her breathing settling into something calmer and more even than it had been in days. Ronan remained kneeling beside her bed for a long while, watching her sleep, before finally rising and turning toward Ren, who had witnessed the entire exchange with tears still glistening in her eyes. She asked something significant of both of us, he said quietly. She did, Ren agreed, her voice unsteady with emotion. I meant what I promised her, Ronan continued, closing the distance between them slowly. Whatever comes, Ren, I do not wish to let fear or politics determine the course of what has grown between us these past weeks. You have taught me far more than simple knitting. You have taught me to value honesty, patience, and the courage required to pursue something meaningful, despite the risks involved. Ren studied him for a long moment, her expression shifting through uncertainty toward something warmer, more open than she had allowed herself to show throughout their entire acquaintance. I feel the same, she admitted softly, though I confess, the thought of what pursuing this fully might mean, for both of us, still frightens me considerably. It frightens me as well, Ronan said honestly. Yet I find I would rather face that fear alongside you than retreat into the safety of pretending these feelings do not exist. They stood together in the quiet chamber a while longer, neither quite ready to break the fragile intimacy of the moment, by returning to the practical concerns waiting beyond its walls. Eventually, Ren moved to gather her needles and the remaining scraps of blue wool scattered across the small table, where they had worked through the final stitches together. You should rest, she said gently. You have given everything these past weeks, to the blanket and to your mother's comfort. Whatever tomorrow brings, you will face it better with some sleep behind you. And you? Ronan asked. You have given just as much, perhaps more, teaching a stubborn king patience he did not know he lacked. Ren offered a tired, genuine smile. I will rest as well, though I suspect sleep may prove difficult, given everything your mother asked of us tonight. Ronan walked her to the door of the chamber, pausing before she could depart fully into the quiet castle corridors beyond. Ren, he said, whatever the court decides, whatever Kestrel or others attempt in the coming days, I meant every word of the promise I made my mother tonight. I believe you, Ren said softly, and I find myself, despite every reasonable fear, wanting to trust in that promise fully. She left him then, making her way slowly toward her own chambers through the dimly lit corridors, while Ronan returned to sit once more beside his mother's bed, watching her sleep peacefully beneath the blanket he had made with his own imperfect, patient hands. The castle around them remained quiet, unaware yet of the significance of what had transpired within these walls that evening, though morning would bring its own challenges regardless. Political consequences neither he nor Ren could fully anticipate, waiting just beyond the fragile peace of this single, precious night. For now, though, there was only his mother's steady breathing, the soft weight of blue wool wrapped around her frail shoulders, and the quiet certainty that whatever remained ahead, he would face it having finally learned the lesson she had hoped to teach him from the very beginning. That strength worth having required tenderness alongside discipline, and that love, honestly pursued despite every obstacle, remained worth whatever price circumstance demanded in return. Whatever awaited them beyond this quiet, private moment, both understood clearly now that the connection they had built together deserved to be honored, regardless of whatever challenges remained ahead. Queen Mother Alara passed 3 days later, in the early hours before dawn, wrapped in the blanket her son had made with his own hands. Ronan sat beside her through the final night, holding her hand as her breathing grew shallower with each passing hour, Ren remaining quietly at his side throughout the long vigil, offering silent support neither of them needed to voice aloud. Alara had remained lucid for much of the previous evening, speaking softly of memories from her long life, of Ronan's father and the early years of their reign, of a young boy who had once refused to be parted from her side during long court sessions. "I am not afraid," she told Ronan quietly, sometime past midnight, her voice barely more than a whisper against the quiet chamber. "I have lived a full life, ruled beside a man I loved deeply, and raised a son who has become a king worth admiring, whatever doubts he carries about his own tenderness. I could not ask for more than what I have been given." "I am not ready to lose you," Ronan admitted, his composure finally breaking in the private darkness of the chamber, tears he had held back for weeks, finally spilling freely. "You are more ready than you believe," Alara said gently, her thin fingers brushing against his cheek with surprising tenderness despite her fading strength. "You have already learned the lesson I hope to teach you, through needle and thread and patient failure. You have learned that strength and softness need not stand opposed to one another. Carry that lesson forward, my son, long after I am gone." She turned her gaze toward Ren then, who sat quietly nearby, tears of her own tracing silent paths down her cheeks. "And you," Alara said, her voice growing fainter, "you have given my son something I feared he might never find amid the burdens of his crown. Do not let him retreat back into those walls once I am gone. He will need you more than ever in the difficult days ahead." "I will not leave him," Ren promised softly, moving closer to take Alara's other hand in her own. "Whatever comes, Your Majesty, I intend to remain beside him, however complicated that choice proves for either of us." Alara's exhausted smile deepened at the promise, satisfaction settling fully across her weathered features, despite her evident pain. "Then I may rest peacefully," she whispered, "knowing my son will not face what remains ahead entirely alone." She drifted into sleep sometime after, her breathing growing steadily shallower through the remaining hours of night, until finally, just as the first gray light of dawn began creeping through the chamber's narrow windows, her breathing simply ceased, peaceful and unlabored, exactly as she had hoped it might. Ronan sat motionless for a long while afterward, his mother's hand still held gently in his own, the weight of the loss settling over him with a finality he had prepared for weeks, yet still found impossible to fully absorb. Ren remained beside him throughout, saying nothing, offering only quiet, steady presence, as grief finally claimed him fully. The kingdom mourned formally for a full week following the Queen Mother's passing, black banners hanging from every tower of Blackwood Castle, villagers throughout the territory observing quiet tribute to a ruler who had guided their lands through decades of both hardship and prosperity. Ronan bore the formal mourning rituals with the same steady composure he brought to all matters of state, though those closest to him recognized the deeper grief carried quietly beneath his controlled exterior. Ren remained at the castle throughout the mourning period, her presence no longer questioned openly given the circumstances, though whispers regarding her position and intentions continued circulating among certain factions of the nobility. Lord Castellan, in particular, maintained his cautious reservations, approaching Ronan directly once the initial period of formal mourning had concluded. "Your Majesty," Castellan said carefully, finding Ronan alone in his private study, reviewing correspondence that had accumulated during the days of mourning. I understand this is a difficult time, yet matters of succession and stability cannot wait indefinitely. The court requires clarity regarding your intentions toward the woman Wren Ashby, particularly given how publicly her presence within these walls has become. Ronan set aside the correspondence, studying his advisor with the same steady patience he had cultivated throughout the recent weeks of transformation. What clarity does the court require? Precisely, Castellan. Whether this arrangement represents something temporary, born of grief and unusual circumstance, or something more permanent that the nobility must formally acknowledge and accommodate, Castellan said. Alpha Kestrel and others continue watching closely, Your Majesty. Ambiguity invites exactly the kind of challenge you successfully repelled weeks ago, yet that success depended partly on the perception that circumstances remain temporary rather than lasting. Ronan considered his advisor's words carefully, recognizing the legitimate political concern underlying them, yet finding himself unwilling, as he had been throughout the recent weeks of transformation, to let political calculation override the promise made to his dying mother. There is no ambiguity remaining, Castellan, Ronan said finally. I intend to make my position regarding Wren entirely clear, formally and publicly, before the full court. Arrange a formal gathering within the week. Castellan's eyebrows rose slightly at the directness of the response, though he offered no further objection, recognizing perhaps that his king's resolve on this matter had grown beyond further debate. As you wish, Your Majesty, I will make the necessary arrangements. The formal gathering convened 7 days later, the great hall filled with nobles and advisors from throughout Blackwood territory, along with representatives from several neighboring kingdoms who had traveled to witness whatever announcement the young king intended to make following his mother's passing. Wren stood near the edge of the assembled crowd, her expression carefully composed despite the evident nervousness Ronan recognized in her posture, uncertain what exactly he intended to declare before this considerable audience. Ronan rose from his throne, addressing the assembled court with the same measured authority that had guided Blackwood territory successfully through countless challenges during his reign. I have called you together today, he began, to address rumors and speculation that have circulated throughout this kingdom regarding my personal affairs these past several weeks. I intend to resolve that speculation now, entirely and permanently. The hall fell silent, every eye fixed upon their king as he continued, his gaze finding Wren's among the assembled crowd, steady and unwavering despite the magnitude of what he intended to declare. Weeks ago, my mother, the Queen Mother Elara, made a simple yet profound request of me before her passing. She asked that I learn, with my own hands, to create something meaningful for her, a gift born of patience and love, rather than skill or wealth. In pursuing that request, I met a woman whose wisdom and steady character taught me far more than simple craft. She taught me that strength worth possessing requires tenderness alongside discipline, and that vulnerability, honestly offered, invites connection rather than exploitation. He paused, drawing a steadying breath before continuing, aware of the weight every word carried before this considerable audience. My mother's final wish, beyond the blanket I made for her, was that I not allow fear or political convenience to determine matters that mattered more deeply than any throne. I intend to honor that wish fully, today, before this entire court. Ronan descended from his throne, crossing the great hall directly toward where Wren stood, murmurs rippling through the assembled nobility as understanding began dawning regarding what their king intended. He stopped before her, taking her hands gently in his own, his expression carrying none of the careful political calculation that had characterized so much of his reign, only genuine, unguarded devotion. Wren Ashby, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, you taught me patience through failure, honesty through vulnerability, and love through the simple, humbling act of learning something new for someone I cherished deeply. I do not wish to hide what has grown between us any longer, regardless of political convenience or courtly expectation. I ask you, before this entire court, to become my chosen mate, and to rule beside me as this kingdom's queen. Wren's eyes filled with tears, genuine surprise and overwhelming emotion evident across her features as she absorbed the magnitude of his public declaration. Ronan, she whispered, you understand what accepting this means, the scrutiny, the political complications that will inevitably follow. I understand fully, Ronan said, and I find I care considerably less about those complications than I once believed possible. I love you, Ren. Not simply for teaching me a craft my mother requested, but for teaching me to become the kind of ruler and the kind of man my mother always believed I could become. Whatever challenges lie ahead, I would rather face them with you beside me than rule alone, however politically convenient solitude might prove. Ren studied him for a long, breathless moment, the entire hall watching in tense silence as she weighed his declaration against everything that had unfolded across the recent weeks of their unusual, transformative acquaintance. Finally, her expression softened fully into genuine joy, tears spilling freely down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite its unsteadiness. "Yes, Ronan, I will stand beside you, as your chosen mate, and as this kingdom's queen, whatever complications or challenges that choice invites." The hall erupted into a mixture of surprised murmurs and, gradually, genuine approval, many among the assembled nobility recognizing the sincerity and courage behind their king's public declaration. Even Lord Castellan, watching from his customary position near the throne, offered a rare, genuine smile at the scene unfolding before him, whatever political reservations he had harbored finally yielding to simple recognition of authentic devotion witnessed firsthand. In the months that followed, Ronan's reign transformed gradually, yet unmistakably, tempered by the tenderness and patience Ren had first taught him through needle and thread, without ever losing the discipline and strength that had made Blackwood territory formidable throughout his years of rule. Alpha Kestrel's ambitions, deprived of the vulnerability he had hoped to exploit, gradually receded into cautious diplomatic distance rather than open challenge, recognizing that whatever personal transformation their rival king had undergone, his strength as a ruler remained entirely undiminished. Ren settled into her new role gradually, bringing to the castle the same quiet wisdom and steady character that had first drawn Ronan to her small cottage weeks earlier, teaching not only her husband, but eventually their entire court, that true strength required tenderness, alongside discipline, patience alongside power. The blanket Alara had requested remained displayed prominently within the castle's private chambers, a permanent reminder of the lesson that had transformed both a grieving son and the kingdom he ruled. On quiet evenings, long after the formal duties of rule had concluded, Ronan and Ren often sat together beside a private hearth, needles and wool spread between them, continuing the craft that had first brought them together, a small, private ritual that reminded them both, regardless of whatever challenges the wider kingdom presented, that the most meaningful strength often revealed itself in the smallest, most patient acts of devotion. One such evening, nearly a year after Alara's passing, Ren found Ronan sitting quietly in his private study, the finished blanket spread carefully across his desk, his fingers tracing the imperfect stitches along its border with quiet reflection. "You are thinking of her again," Ren observed gently, settling into the chair beside him. "Always," Ronan admitted. "Though the grief has softened considerably since those first difficult months, I find myself grateful more often than sorrowful now, remembering how she guided me toward you, even in her final weeks." "She would be proud of what you have built since," Ren said, resting her hand gently over his, where it lay against the worn fabric. "Not simply the kingdom's continued stability, but the way you have brought tenderness into your rule, without ever sacrificing the strength that protects it." Ronan turned to study her, warmth and gratitude evident in his expression despite the quiet melancholy that memories of his mother still occasionally stirred. "None of it would have been possible without you," he said. "You gave me patience when I had none, taught me humility when pride alone would have failed me entirely." "We taught each other, I think," Ren said softly. "You gave me reason to open my quiet, solitary life to something considerably larger and more uncertain, and found I do not regret a single moment of that uncertainty." They sat together a while longer in comfortable silence, the finished blanket resting between them, as a permanent reminder of everything their unusual acquaintance had grown to become, before eventually rising to attend to whatever remained of the evening's quiet duties, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future presented, they would face them together, guided by the tenderness and patience that had first brought them together over a simple pair of knitting needles and a dying queen's final, profound wish. The Alpha King, who once ruled through discipline and unwavering strength alone, had learned, through his mother's final wish and a stubborn seamstress's patient teaching, that a kingdom governed with tenderness, alongside power, proved far more resilient than one built on strength alone. And in the quiet moments between the demands of rule, he found himself continually grateful for the humble craft that had taught him this lesson, and for the woman who had guided him toward it, with unwavering patience and honest, steady love.